Chapter 58 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 58. A quarterdeck officer before the mast. As we were somewhat short-handed while we lay in Rio, we received a small draft of men from a United States sloop of war, whose 3 years' term of service would expire about the time of our arrival in America. Under guard of an armed lieutenant and 4 midshipmen, they came on board in the afternoon. They were immediately mustered in the starboard gangway, that Mr. Bridewell, our first lieutenant, might take down their names and assign them their stations. They stood in a mute and solemn row. The officer advanced, with his memorandum book and pencil. My casual friend Shakings, the holder, happened to be by at the time. Touching my arm, he said, "White Jacket, this here reminds me of Sing Sing, when a draft of fellows and darbies came on from the state prison at Auburn for a change of scene like, you know." After taking down 4 or 5 names, Mr. Bridewell accosted the next man, a rather good-looking person, but from his haggard cheek and sunken eye, he seemed to have been in the sad habit, all his life, of sitting up rather late at night, and though all sailors do certainly keep late hours enough, standing watches at midnight, yet there is no small difference between keeping late hours at sea and keeping late hours ashore. "What's your name?" asked the officer of this rather rakish-looking recruit. "Mandeville, sir," said the man, courteously touching his cap. "You must remember me, sir," he added, in a low, confidential tone, strangely dashed with servility. "We sailed together once in the old Macedonian, sir. I wore an epaulet then. We had the same stateroom, you know, sir. I'm your old chum, Mandeville, sir," and he again touched his cap. "I remember an officer by that name," said the first lieutenant, emphatically, "and I know you, fellow. But I know you henceforth for a common sailor. I can show no favoritism here. If you ever violate the ship's rules, you shall be flogged like any other seaman. I place you in the foretop. Go forward to your duty." It seemed this Mandeville had entered the Navy when very young, and had risen to be a lieutenant, as he said, but brandy had been his bane. One night, when he had the deck of a line-of-battle ship in the Mediterranean, he was seized with a fit of mania a potu, and being out of his senses for the time, went below and turned into his berth, leaving the deck without a commanding officer. For this unpardonable offence he was broken. Having no fortune, and no other profession than the sea, upon his disgrace, he entered the merchant service as a chief mate. But his love of strong drink still pursuing him, he was again cashiered at sea, and degraded before the mast by the captain. After this, in a state of intoxication, he re-entered the Navy at Pensacola as a common sailor. But all these lessons, so biting bitter to learn, could not cure him of his sin. He had hardly been a week on board the Neversink when he was found intoxicated with smuggled spirits. They lashed him to the gratings, and ignominiously scourged him under the eye of his old friend and comrade, the first lieutenant. This took place while we lay in port, which reminds me of the circumstance that when punishment is about to be inflicted in harbor, all strangers are ordered ashore, and the sentries at the side have it in strict charge to wave off all boats drawing near. End of Chapter 58. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 59 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 59. A Man-of-War Button Divides Two Brothers. The conduct of Mandeville in claiming the acquaintance of the first lieutenant under such disreputable circumstances was strongly contrasted by the behavior of another person on board, placed for a time in a somewhat similar situation. Among the genteel youths of the afterguard was a lad of about 16, a very handsome young fellow with starry eyes, curly hair of a golden color, and a bright, sunshiny complexion. He must have been the son of some goldsmith. He was one of the few sailors, not in the maintop, whom I used to single out for occasional conversation. After several friendly interviews, he became quite frank, and communicated certain portions of his history. There is some charm in the sea which induces most persons to be very communicative concerning themselves. We had lain in Rio but a day when I observed that this lad, whom I shall here call Frank, wore an unwonted expression of sadness mixed with apprehension. I questioned him as to the cause, but he chose to conceal it. Not 3 days after, he abruptly accosted me on the gun-deck, where I happened to be taking a promenade. "I can't keep it to myself any more," he said. "I must have a confidant, or I shall go mad." "What is the matter?" said I, in alarm. "Matter enough. Look at this." And he handed me a torn half-sheet of an old New York Herald, putting his finger upon a particular word in a particular paragraph. It was the announcement of the sailing from the Brooklyn Navy Yard of a United States store ship with provisions for the squadron in Rio. It was upon a particular name, in the list of officers and midshipmen, that Frank's fingers was placed. "That is my own brother," said he. "He must have got a reefer's warrant since I left home. Now, White Jacket, what's to be done? I have calculated that the store ship may be expected here every day. My brother will then see me, he an officer, and I a miserable sailor, that any moment may be flogged at the gangway, before his very eyes. Heavens, White Jacket, what shall I do? Would you run? Do you think there is any chance to desert? I won't see him, by heaven, with this sailor's frock on, and he with the anchor button." "Why, Frank," said I do not really see sufficient cause for this fit you are in. Your brother is an officer, very good, and you are nothing but a sailor, but that is no disgrace. If he comes on board here, go up to him and take him by the hand. Believe me, he will be glad enough to see you." Frank started from his desponding attitude, and fixing his eyes full upon mine, with clasped hands, exclaimed, "White Jacket, I have been from home nearly 3 years. In that time I have never heard one word from my family, and though God knows how I love them, yet I swear to you that though my brother can tell me whether my sisters are still alive, yet, rather than accost him in this lined frock, I would go 10 centuries without hearing one syllable from home." Amazed at his earnestness, and hardly able to account for it altogether, I stood silent a moment, then said, "Why, Frank, this midshipman is your own brother, you say. Now, do you really think that your own flesh and blood is going to give himself airs over you, simply because he sports large brass buttons on his coat? Never believe it. If he does, he can be no brother, and ought to be hanged. That's all." "Don't say that again," said Frank resentfully. "My brother is a noble-hearted fellow. I love him as I do myself. You don't understand me, White Jacket. Don't you see that when my brother arrives he must consort more or less with our chuckle-headed reefers on board here? There's that namby-pamby Miss Nancy of a white-face, Stribbles, who the other day, when Mad Jack's back was turned, ordered me to hand him the spy-glass as if he were a commodore. Do you suppose, now, I want my brother to see me a lackey abroad here? By heaven, it is enough to drive one distracted. What's to be done?" he cried fiercely. Much more passed between us, but all my philosophy was in vain. And at last Frank departed, his head hanging down in despondency. For several days after, whenever the quartermaster reported a sail entering the harbor, Frank was foremost in the rigging to observe it. At length, one afternoon, a vessel drawing near was reported to be the long-expected store-ship. I looked round for Frank on the spar-deck, but he was nowhere to be seen. He must have been below, gazing out of a port-hole. The vessel was hailed from our poop, and came to anchor within a biscuit's toss of our batteries. That evening I heard that Frank had ineffectually endeavored to get removed from his place as an oarsman in the first cutter, a boat which, from its size, is generally employed with the launch in carrying ship stores. When I thought that, the very next day perhaps, this boat would be plying between the store-ship and our frigate, I was at no loss to account for Frank's attempts to get rid of his oar, and felt heartily grieved at their failure. Next morning the bugler called away the first cutter's crew, and Frank entered the boat with his hat slouched over his eyes. Upon his return, I was all eagerness to learn what had happened, and, as the communication of his feelings was a grateful relief, he poured his whole story into my ear. It seemed that, with his comrades, he mounted the store-ship's side and hurried forward to the forecastle. Then, turning anxiously toward the quarter-deck, he spied two midshipmen leaning against the bulwarks, conversing. One was the officer of his boat. Was the other his brother? No. He was too tall, too large. Thank heaven, it was not him. And perhaps his brother had not sailed from home, after all. There might have been some mistake. But suddenly the strange midshipman laughed aloud, and that laugh Frank had heard 1,000 times before. It was a free, hearty laugh, a brother's laugh, but it carried a pang to the heart of poor Frank. He was now ordered down to the main deck to assist in removing the stores. The boat being loaded, he was ordered into her, when, looking toward the gangway, he perceived the two midshipmen lounging upon each side of it, so that no one could pass them without brushing their persons. But again, pulling his hat over his eyes, Frank, darting between them, gained his oar. "How my heart thumped," he said, "when I actually felt him so near me! But I wouldn't look at him. No, I'd have died first." To Frank's great relief, the store-ship at last moved further up the bay, and it fortunately happened that he saw no more of his brother while in Rio, and while there he never in any way made himself known to him. End of Chapter 59. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 60 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 60. A Man-of-War's Man Shot At. There was a seaman belonging to the foretop, a messmate, though not a topmate of mine, and no favorite of the captain's, who, for certain venial transgressions, had been prohibited from going ashore on liberty when the ship's company went. Enraged at the deprivation, for he had not touched earth in upward of a year, he, some nights after, lowered himself overboard with the view of gaining a canoe attached by a rope to a Dutch galliot some cable's lengths distant. In this canoe he proposed paddling himself ashore. Not being a very expert swimmer, the commotion he made in the water attracted the ear of the sentry on that side of the ship, who, turning about in his walk, perceived the faint white spot where the fugitive was swimming in the frigate's shadow. He hailed it, but no reply. "Give the word, or I fire!" Not a word was heard. The next instant there was a red flash, and, before it had completely ceased illuminating the night, the white spot was changed into crimson. Some of the officers, returning from a party at the beach of the Flamingos, happened to be drawing near the ship in one of her cutters. They saw the flash and the bounding body it revealed. In a moment, the topman was dragged into the boat, a handkerchief was used for a tourniquet, and the wounded fugitive was soon on board the frigate, when the surgeon, being called, the necessary attentions were rendered. Now, it appeared that at the moment the sentry fired, the topman, in order to elude discovery, by manifesting the completest quietude, was floating on the water, straight and horizontal, as if reposing on a bed. As he was not far from the ship at the time, and the sentry was considerably elevated above him, pacing his platform on a level with the upper part of the hammock nettings, the ball struck with great force, with a downward obliquity, entering the right thigh just above the knee, and, penetrating some inches, glanced upward along the bone, burying itself somewhere, so that it could not be felt by outward manipulation. There was no dusky discoloration to mark its internal track, as in the case when a partly spent ball, obliquely hitting after entering the skin, courses on, just beneath the surface, without penetrating further. Nor was there any mark on the opposite part of the thigh, to denote its place, as when a ball forces itself straight through a limb, and lodges, perhaps, close to the skin on the other side. Nothing was visible but a small, ragged puncture, bluish about the edges, as if the rough point of a tenpenny nail had been forced into the flesh and withdrawn. It seemed almost impossible that through so small an aperture a musket bullet could have penetrated. The extreme misery and general prostration of the man, caused by the great effusion of blood, though strange to say, at first he said he felt no pain from the wound itself, induced the surgeon, very reluctantly, to forego an immediate search for the ball to extract it, as that would have involved the dilating of the wound by the knife, an operation which at that juncture would have been almost certainly attended with fatal results. A day or two, therefore, was permitted to pass while simple dressings were applied. The surgeon of the other American ships of war in harbor occasionally visited the Neversink to examine the patient and, incidentally, to listen to the expositions of our own surgeon, their senior in rank. But Cadwallader Cuticle, who as yet has been but incidentally alluded to, now deserves a chapter by himself. End of Chapter 60. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 61 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 61. The Surgeon of the Fleet. Cadwallader Cuticle, M.D., and honorary member of the most distinguished colleges of surgeons both in Europe and America, was our surgeon of the fleet. Nor was he at all blind to the dignity of his position, to which, indeed, he was rendered peculiarly competent, if the reputation he enjoyed was deserved. He had the name of being the foremost surgeon in the Navy, a gentleman of remarkable science and a veteran practitioner. He was a small, withered man, nearly, perhaps quite, 60 years of age. His chest was shallow, his shoulders bent, his pantaloons hung round skeleton legs, and his face was singularly attenuated. In truth, the corporeal vitality of this man seemed in a good degree to have died out of him. He walked abroad, a curious patchwork of life and death, with a wig, one glass eye, and a set of false teeth, while his voice was husky and thick. But his mind seemed undebilitated, as in youth. It shone out of his remaining eye with basilisk brilliancy. Like most old physicians and surgeons who have seen much service and have been promoted to high professional place for their scientific attainments, this Cuticle was an enthusiast in his calling. In private, he had once been heard to say, confidentially, that he would rather cut off a man's arm than dismember the wing of the most delicate pheasant. In particular, the department of morbid anatomy was his peculiar love, and in his state-room below he had a most unsightly collection of Parisian casts in plaster and wax, representing all imaginable malformations of the human members, both organic and induced by disease. Chief among these was a cast often to be met with in the anatomical museums of Europe, and no doubt an unexaggerated copy of a genuine original. It was the head of an elderly woman, with an aspect singularly gentle and meek, but at the same time wonderfully expressive of a gnawing sorrow never to be relieved. You would almost have thought it the face of some abbess, for some unspeakable crime voluntarily sequestered from human society, and leading a life of agonized penitence without hope. So marvelously sad and tearfully pitiable was this head. But when you first beheld it, no such emotions ever crossed your mind. All your eyes and all your horrified soul were fast fascinated and frozen by the sight of a hideous crumpled horn, like that of a ram, downward growing out from the forehead, and partly shadowing the face. But as you gazed, the freezing fascination of its horribleness gradually waned, and then your whole heart burst with sorrow as you contemplated those aged features, ashy pale and wan. The horn seemed the mark of a curse for some mysterious sin conceived and committed before the spirit had entered the flesh. Yet that sin seemed something imposed, and not voluntarily sought, some sin growing out of the heartless necessities of the predestination of things, some sin under which the sinner sank in sinless woe. But no pang of pain, not the slightest touch of concern, ever crossed the bosom of Cuticle when he looked on this cast. It was immovably fixed to a bracket against the partition of his state-room, so that it was the first object that greeted his eyes when he opened them from his nightly sleep. Nor was it to hide the face that upon retiring he always hung his navy cap upon the upward curling extremity of the horn, for that obscured it but little. The surgeon's cot-boy, the lad who made up his swinging bed and took care of his room, often told us of the horror he sometimes felt when he would find himself alone in his master's retreat. At times he was seized with the idea that Cuticle was a preternatural being, and once entering his room in the middle watch of the night, he started at finding it enveloped in a thick, bluish vapor, and stifling with the odors of brimstone. Upon hearing a low groan from the smoke, with a wild cry he darted from the place, and, rousing the occupants of the neighboring state-rooms, it was found that the vapor proceeded from smoldering bunches of lucifer matches, which had become ignited through the carelessness of the surgeon. Cuticle, almost dead, was dragged from the suffocating atmosphere, and it was several days ere he completely recovered from its effects. This accident took place immediately over the powder magazine, but as Cuticle, during his sickness, paid dearly enough for transgressing the laws prohibiting combustibles in the gun-room, the captain contented himself with privately remonstrating with him. Well knowing the enthusiasm of the surgeon for all specimens of morbid anatomy, some of the ward-room officers used to play upon his credulity, though in every case Cuticle was not long in discovering their deceptions. Once, when they had some sago pudding for dinner, and Cuticle chanced to be ashore, they made up a neat parcel of this bluish-white, firm, jelly-like preparation, and, placing it in a tin box carefully sealed with wax, they deposited it on the gun-room table with a note purporting to come from an eminent physician in Rio, connected with the Grand National Museum on the Praça da Clamajao. begging leave to present the scientific Senor Cuticle, with the donor's compliments, an uncommonly fine specimen of a cancer. Descending to the wardroom, Cuticle spied the note, and no sooner read it than, clutching the case, he opened it and exclaimed, "Beautiful! Splendid! I have never seen a finer specimen of this most interesting disease." "What have you there, Surgeon Cuticle?" said a lieutenant, advancing. "Why, sir, look at it. Did you ever see anything more exquisite?" "Very exquisite indeed. Let me have a bit of it, will you, Cuticle?" "Let you have a bit of it?" shrieked the surgeon, starting back. "Let you have one of my limbs? I wouldn't mar so large a specimen for $100. But what can you want of it? You are not making collections." "I'm fond of the article," said the lieutenant. "It's a fine, cold relish to bacon or ham. You know, I was in New Zealand last cruise, Cuticle, and got into sad dissipation there among the cannibals. Come, let's have a bit, if it's only a mouthful." "Why, you infernal Fiji!" shouted Cuticle, eyeing the other with a confounded expression. "You don't really mean to eat a piece of this cancer?" "Hand it to me, and see whether I will not," was the reply. "In God's name, take it!" cried the surgeon, putting the case into his hands, and then standing with his own uplifted. "Steward!" cried the lieutenant. "The castor, quick! I always use plenty of pepper with this dish, surgeon. It's oystery. Ah, this is really delicious," he added, smacking his lips over a mouthful. "Try it now, surgeon, and you'll never keep such a fine dish as this lying uneaten on your hands as a mere scientific curiosity." Cuticle's whole countenance changed, and slowly walking up to the table, he put his nose close to the tin case, then touched its contents with his finger and tasted it. "Enough!" Buttoning up his coat, in all the tremblings of an old man's rage, he burst from the wardroom, and, calling for a boat, was not seen again for 24 hours. But though, like all other mortals, Cuticle was subject at times to these fits of passion, at least under outrageous provocation, nothing could exceed his coolness when actually employed in his eminent vocation. Surrounded by moans and shrieks, by features distorted with anguish inflicted by himself, he yet maintained a countenance almost supernaturally calm, and unless the intense interest of the operation flushed his wan face with a momentary tinge of professional enthusiasm, he toiled away untouched by the keenest misery coming under a fleet surgeon's eye. Indeed, long habitation to the dissecting-room and the amputation table had made him seemingly impervious to the ordinary emotions of humanity. Yet you could not say that Cuticle was essentially a cruel-hearted man. His apparent heartlessness must have been of a purely scientific origin. It is not to be imagined even that Cuticle would have harmed a fly, unless he could procure a microscope powerful enough to assist him in experimenting on the minute vitals of the creature. But, notwithstanding his marvellous indifference to the sufferings of his patients, and spite even of his enthusiasm in his vocation, not cooled by frosting old age itself, Cuticle, on some occasions, would affect a certain disrelish of his profession, and declaim against the necessity that forced a man of his humanity to perform a surgical operation. Especially was it apt to be thus with him, when the case was one of more than ordinary interest. In discussing it previous to setting about it, he would veil his eagerness under an aspect of great circumspection, curiously marred, however, by continual sallies of unsuppressible impatience. But the knife once in his hand, the compassionless surgeon himself, undisguised, stood before you. Such was Cadwallader Cuticle, our surgeon of the fleet. End of chapter 61. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 62 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 62. A Consultation of Man-of-War Surgeons. It seems customary for the surgeon of the fleet, when any important operation in his department is on the anvil, and there is nothing to absorb professional attention from it, to invite his brother surgeons, if at hand at the time, to a ceremonious consultation upon it. And this, in courtesy, his brother surgeons expect. In pursuance of this custom, then, the surgeons of the neighboring American ships of war were requested to visit the Neversink in a body to advise concerning the case of the topman, whose situation had now become critical. They assembled on the half-deck, and were soon joined by their respected senior, Cuticle. In a body they bowed as he approached, and accosted him with deferential regard. "Gentlemen," said Cuticle, unostentatiously seating himself on a camp-stool handed him by his cot-boy, "we have here an extremely interesting case. You have all seen the patient, I believe. At first I had hopes that I should have been able to cut down to the ball and remove it. But the state of the patient forbade. Since then, the inflammation and sloughing of the part has been attended with a copious suppuration, great loss of substance, extreme debility and emaciation. From this, I am convinced that the ball has shattered and deadened the bone, and now lies impacted in the medullary canal. In fact, there can be no doubt that the wound is incurable, and that amputation is the only resource. But, gentlemen, I find myself placed in a very delicate predicament. I assure you I feel no professional anxiety to perform the operation. I desire your advice, and if you will now again visit the patient with me, we can then return here and decide what is best to be done. Once more, let me say that I feel no personal anxiety whatever to use the knife." The assembled surgeons listened to this address with the most serious attention, and, in accordance with their superior's desire, now descended to the sick-bay, where the patient was languishing. The examination concluded, they returned to the half-deck, and the consultation was renewed. "Gentlemen," began Cuticle again, seating himself, "you have now just inspected the limb. You have seen that there is no resource but amputation. And now, gentlemen, what do you say? Surgeon Bandage, of the Mohawk, will you express your opinion?" "The wound is a very serious one," said Bandage, a corpulent man with a high German forehead, shaking his head solemnly. "Can anything save him but amputation?" demanded Cuticle. "His constitutional debility is extreme," observed Bandage, "but I have seen more dangerous cases." "Surgeon Wedge, of the Malay," said Cuticle, in a pet, "be pleased to give your opinion, and let it be definitive, I entreat." This was said with a severe glance toward Bandage. "If I thought," began Wedge, a very spare, tall man, elevating himself still higher on his toes, "that the ball had shattered and divided the whole femur, including the greater and lesser trochanter, the linear aspera, the digital fossa, and the intertrochanteric, I should certainly be in favor of amputation. But that, sir, permit me to observe, is not my opinion." "Surgeon Sawyer, of the Buccaneer," said Cuticle, drawing in his thin lower lip with vexation, and turning to a round-faced, florid, frank, sensible-looking man, whose uniform coat very handsomely fitted him, and was adorned with an unusual quantity of gold lace. "Surgeon Sawyer, of the Buccaneer, let us now hear your opinion, if you please. Is not amputation the only resource, sir?" "Excuse me," said Sawyer, "I am decidedly opposed to it, for if hitherto the patient has not been strong enough to undergo the extraction of the ball, I do not see how he can be expected to endure a far more severe operation. As there is no immediate danger of mortification, and you say the ball cannot be reached without making large incisions, I should support him, I think, for the present, with tonics and gentle antiphlogistics, locally applied. On no account would I proceed to amputation until further symptoms are exhibited. "Surgeon Patella of the Algerine," said Cuticle in an ill-suppressed passion, abruptly turning round on the person addressed. "Will you have the kindness to say whether you do not think that amputation is the only resource?" Now, Patella was the youngest of the company, a modest man filled with a profound reverence for the science of Cuticle, and desirous of gaining his good opinion, yet not wishing to commit himself altogether by a decided reply, though, like Surgeon Sawyer, in his own mind, he might have been clearly against the operation. "What have you remarked, Mr. Surgeon of the Fleet," said Patella, respectfully hemming, "concerning the dangerous condition of the limb, seems obvious enough. Amputation would certainly be a cure to the wound, but then, as, notwithstanding his present debility, the patient seems to have a strong constitution, he might rally, as it is, and by your scientific treatment, Mr. Surgeon of the Fleet," bowing, "be entirely made whole, without risking an amputation. Still, it is a very critical case, and amputation may be indispensable, and if it is to be performed, there ought to be no delay whatever. That is my view of the case, Mr. Surgeon of the Fleet." "Surgeon Patella, then, gentlemen," said Cuticle, turning round triumphantly, "is clearly of opinion that amputation should be immediately performed. For my own part, individually, I mean, and without respect to the patient, I am sorry to have it so decided. But this settles the question, gentlemen. In my own mind, however, it was settled before. At 10 o'clock tomorrow morning the operation will be performed. I shall be happy to see you all on the occasion, and also your juniors," alluding to the absent assistant surgeons. "Good morning, gentlemen. At 10 o'clock, remember." And Cuticle retreated to the wardroom. End of Chapter 62. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 63 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 63. The Operation. Next morning, at the appointed hour, the surgeons arrived in a body. They were accompanied by their juniors, young men ranging in age from 19 years to 30. Like the senior surgeons, these young gentlemen were arrayed in their blue navy uniforms, displaying a profusion of bright buttons and several broad bars of gold lace about the wristbands. As in honor of the occasion, they had put on their best coats. They looked exceedingly brilliant. The whole party immediately descended to the half-deck, where preparations had been made for the operation. A large garrison ensign was stretched across the ship by the mainmast, so as completely to screen the space behind. This space included the whole extent aft to the bulkhead of the Commodore's cabin, at the door of which the marine orderly paced, in plain sight, cutlass in hand. Upon two gun-carriages, dragged amidships, the death-board, used for burials at sea, was horizontally placed, covered with an old royal stunsail. Upon this occasion, to do duty as an amputation table, it was widened by an additional plank. Two match-tubs near by, placed one upon another, at either end supporting another plank, distinct from the table, whereon was exhibited an array of saws and knives of various and peculiar shapes and sizes. Also, a sort of steel, something like the dinner-table implement, together with long needles, crooked at the end for taking up the arteries, and large darning needles, thread, and beeswax for sewing up a wound. At the end, nearest the large table, was a tin basin of water, surrounded by small sponges placed at mathematical intervals. From the long horizontal pole of a great gun rammer, fixed in its usual place overhead, hung a number of towels, with U.S. marked in the corners. All these arrangements had been made by the surgeon's steward, a person whose important functions in a man of war will, in a future chapter, be entered upon at large. Upon the present occasion he was bustling about, adjusting and readjusting the knives, needles, and carver, like an over-conscientious butler, fidgeting over a dinner-table just before the convivialists enter. But by far the most striking object to be seen behind the ensign was a human skeleton, whose every joint articulated with wires. By a rivet at the apex of the skull, it hung dangling from a hammock hook fixed in a beam above. Why this object was here will presently be seen, but why it was placed immediately at the foot of the amputation table only Surgeon Cuticle can tell. While the final preparations were being made, Cuticle stood conversing with the assembled surgeons and assistant surgeons, his invited guests. "Gentlemen," said he, taking up one of the glittering knives and artistically drawing the steel across it, "Gentlemen, though these scenes are very unpleasant, and in some moods, I may say, repulsive to me, yet how much better for our patient to have the contusions and lacerations of his present wound, with all its dangerous symptoms, converted into a clean incision, free from these objections, and occasioning so much less subsequent anxiety to himself and the surgeon. Yes," he added tenderly, feeling the edge of his knife, "amputation is our only resource. Is it not so, Surgeon Patella?" turning toward that gentleman, as if relying upon some sort of an assent, however clogged with conditions. "Certainly," said Patella. "Amputation is your only resource, Mr. Surgeon of the Fleet. That is, I mean, if you are fully persuaded of its necessity." The other surgeons said nothing, maintaining a somewhat reserved air, as if conscious that they had no positive authority in the case, whatever might be their own private opinions. But they seemed willing to behold, and, if called upon, to assist at the operation, since it could not now be averted. The young men, their assistants, looked very eager, and cast frequent glances of awe upon so distinguished a practitioner as the venerable Cuticle. "They say he can drop a leg in 1 minute and 10 seconds from the moment the knife touches it," whispered one of them to another. "We shall see," was the reply, and the speaker clapped his hand to his fob to see if his watch would be forthcoming when wanted. "Are you all ready here?" demanded Cuticle, now advancing to his steward. "Have not those fellows got through yet?" pointing to 3 men of the carpenter's gang who were placing bits of wood under the gun carriages supporting the central table. "They are just through, sir," respectfully answered the steward, touching his hand to his forehead, as if there were a cap front there. "Bring up the patient, then," said Cuticle. "Young gentlemen," he added, turning to the row of assistant surgeons, "seeing you here reminds me of the classes of students once under my instruction at the Philadelphia College of Physicians and Surgeons. Ah, those were happy days," he sighed, applying the extreme corner of his handkerchief to his glass eye. "Excuse an old man's emotions, young gentlemen, but when I think of the numerous rare cases that then came under my treatment, I cannot but give way to my feelings. The town, the city, the metropolis, young gentlemen, is the place for you students. At least in these dull times of peace, when the Army and Navy furnish no inducements for a youth ambitious of rising in our honorable profession. Take an old man's advice, and if the war now threatening between the States and Mexico should break out, exchange your Navy commissions for commissions in the Army. From having no military marine herself, Mexico has always been backward in furnishing subjects for the amputation tables of foreign navies. The cause of science has languished in her hands. The Army, young gentlemen, is your best school. Depend upon it. You will hardly believe it, Surgeon Bandage," turning to that gentleman, "but this is my first important case of surgery in a nearly 3 years' cruise. I have been almost wholly confined in this ship to doctors' practice prescribing for fevers and fluxes." True, the other day a man fell from the mizzen-top sail yard, but that was merely an aggravated case of dislocations and bones splintered and broken. No one, sir, could have made an amputation of it, without severely contusing his conscience, and mine, I may say, a gentleman, without ostentation, is peculiarly susceptible." And so saying, the knife and carver touchingly dropped to his sides, and he stood for a moment fixed in a tender reverie, but a commotion being heard beyond the curtain, he started, and, briskly crossing and recrossing the knife and carver, exclaimed, "Ali, here comes our patient. Surgeons, this side of the table, if you please. Young gentlemen, a little further off, I beg. Steward, take off my coat, so. My neckerchief now. I must be perfectly unencumbered, Surgeon Patella, or I can do nothing whatever." These articles being removed, he snatched off his wig, placing it on the gun-deck capstan, then took out his set of false teeth and placed it by the side of the wig, and lastly, putting his forefinger to the inner angle of his blind eye, spirited out the glass optic with professional dexterity, and deposited that also next to the wig and false teeth. Thus divested of nearly all inorganic appurtenances, what was left of the surgeon slightly shook itself, to see whether anything more could be spared to advantage. "Carpenter's mates," he now cried, "will you never get through with that job?" "Almost through, sir. Just through," they replied, staring round in search of the strange, unearthly voice that addressed them, for the absence of his teeth had not at all improved the conversational tones of the surgeon of the fleet. With natural curiosity, these men had purposely been lingering, to see all they could; but now, having no further excuse, they snatched up their hammers and chisels, and, like the stage-builders decamping from a public meeting at the 11th hour, after just completing the rostrum in time for the first speaker, the carpenter's gang withdrew. The broad ensign now lifted, revealing a glimpse of the crowd of man-of-war's men outside, and the patient, borne in the arms of two of his messmates, entered the place. He was much emaciated, weak as an infant, and every limb visibly trembled, or rather jarred, like the head of a man with the palsy. As if an organic and involuntary apprehension of death had seized the wounded leg, its nervous motions were so violent that one of the messmates was obliged to keep his hand upon it. The topman was immediately stretched upon the table, the attendants steadying his limbs, when, slowly opening his eyes, he glanced about at the glittering knives and saws, the towels and sponges, the armed sentry at the Commodore's cabin door, the row of eager-eyed students, the meagre death's head of a cuticle, now with his shirt-sleeves rolled up upon his withered arms, and knife in hand, and finally, his eyes settled in horror upon the skeleton, slowly vibrating and jingling before him with the slow, slight roll of the frigate in the water. "I would advise perfect repose of your every limb, my man," said Cuticle, addressing him. "The precision of an operation is often impaired by the inconsiderate restlessness of the patient. But if you consider, my good fellow," he added, in a patronizing and almost sympathetic tone, and slightly pressing his hand on the limb, "if you consider how much better it is to live with 3 limbs than to die with 4, and especially if you but knew to what torments both sailors and soldiers were subjected before the time of Celsus, owing to the lamentable ignorance of surgery then prevailing, you would certainly thank God from the bottom of your heart that your operation has been postponed to the period of this enlightened age, blessed with a Bell, a Brodie, and a Lally. My man, before Celsus's time, such was the general ignorance of our noble science, that, in order to prevent the excessive effusion of blood, it was deemed indispensable to operate with a red-hot knife," making a professional movement toward the thigh, "and pour scalding oil upon the parts," elevating his elbow, as if with a teapot in his hand, "still further to sear them, after amputation had been performed." "He is fainting," said one of his messmates. "Quick, some water." The steward immediately hurried to the topman with the basin. Cuticle took the topman by the wrist, and feeling it a while, observed, Don't be alarmed, men," addressing the two messmates. "He'll recover presently. This fainting very generally takes place." And he stood for a moment, tranquilly eyeing the patient. Now, the surgeon of the fleet and the topman presented a spectacle which, to a reflecting mind, was better than a churchyard sermon on the mortality of man. Here was a sailor who, 4 days previous, had stood erect, a pillar of life, with an arm like a royal mast and a thigh like a windlass. But the slightest conceivable finger-touch of a bit of crooked trigger had eventuated in stretching him out more helpless than an hour-old babe with a blasted thigh, utterly drained of its brawn. And who was it that now stood over him like a superior being, and, as if clothed himself with the attributes of immortality, indifferently discoursed of carving up his broken flesh and thus piecing out his abbreviated days? Who was it that in capacity of surgeon seemed enacting the part of a regenerator of life? The withered, shrunken, one-eyed, toothless, hairless cuticle, with a trunk half dead, a memento mori to behold. And while in those soul-sinking and panic-striking premonitions of speedy death which almost invariably accompany a severe gunshot wound, even with the most intrepid spirits, while thus drooping and dying, this once robust topman's eye was now waning in his head like a Lapland moon being eclipsed in clouds. Cuticle, who for years had still lived in his withered tabernacle of a body, Cuticle, no doubt sharing in the common self-delusion of old age, Cuticle must have felt his hold of life as secure as the grim hug of a grizzly bear. Verily, life is more awful than death, and let no man, though his live heart beat in him like a cannon, let him not hug his life to himself. For, in the predestinated necessities of things, that bounding life of his is not a whit more secure than the life of a man on his deathbed. Today we inhale the air with expanding lungs, and life runs through us like 1,000 Niles. But tomorrow we may collapse in death, and all our veins be dry as the brook Kedron in a drought. "And now, young gentlemen," said Cuticle, turning to the assistant surgeons, "while the patient is coming to, permit me to describe to you the highly interesting operation I am about to perform." "Mr. Surgeon of the Fleet," said Surgeon Bandage, "if you are about to lecture, permit me to present you with your teeth. They will make your discourse more readily understood." And so saying, Bandage, with a bow, placed the 2 semicircles of ivory into Cuticle's hands. "Thank you, Surgeon Bandage," said Cuticle, and slipped the ivory into its place. "In the first place now, young gentlemen, let me direct your attention to the excellent preparation before you. I have had it unpacked from its case and set up here from my state-room, where it occupies the spare berth, and all this for your express benefit, young gentlemen. This skeleton I procured in person from the Hunterian Department of the Royal College of Surgeons in London. It is a masterpiece of art, but we have no time to examine it now. Delicacy forbids that I should amplify at a juncture like this," casting an almost benignant glance toward the patient, now beginning to open his eyes. "But let me point out to you upon this thigh bone," disengaging it from the skeleton, with a gentle twist, "the precise place where I propose to perform the operation. Here, young gentlemen, here is the place. You perceive it is very near the point of articulation with the trunk." "Yes," interposed Surgeon Wedge, rising on his toes, "yes, young gentlemen, the point of articulation with the acetabulum of the os innominatum." "Where's your bell on bones, Dick?" whispered one of the assistants to the student next to him. "Wedge has been spending the whole morning over it, getting out the hard names." "Surgeon Wedge," said Cuticle, looking round severely, "we will dispense with your commentaries, if you please, at present. Now, young gentlemen, you cannot but perceive that the point of operation being so near the trunk and the vitals, it becomes an unusually beautiful one, demanding a steady hand and a true eye, and, after all, the patient may die under my hands." "Quick, steward! Water, water! He's fainting again!" cried the 2 messmates. "Don't be alarmed for your comrade, men," said Cuticle, turning round. I tell you, it is not an uncommon thing for the patient to betray some emotion upon these occasions, most usually manifested by swooning. It is quite natural, it should be so. But we must not delay the operation. Steward, that knife. No, the next one. There, that's it. He is coming to, I think, feeling the topman's wrist. Are you all ready, sir? This last observation was addressed to one of the Neversink's assistant surgeons, a tall, lank, cadaverous young man, arrayed in a sort of shroud of white canvas, pinned about his throat, and completely enveloping his person. He was seated on a match-tub, the skeleton swinging near his head, at the foot of the table, in readiness to grasp the limb, as when a plank is being severed by a carpenter and his apprentice. "The sponges, steward," said Cuticle, for the last time taking out his teeth, and drawing up his shirt-sleeves still further. Then, taking the patient by the wrist, "Stand by, now, you messmates. Keep hold of his arms. Pin him down. Steward, put your hand on the artery. I shall commence as soon as his pulse begins to... Now. Letting fall the wrist, feeling the thigh carefully, and bowing over it an instant, he drew the fatal knife unerringly across the flesh. As it first touched the part, the row of surgeons simultaneously dropped their eyes to the watches in their hands, while the patient lay, with eyes horribly distended, in a kind of waking trance. Not a breath was heard, but as the quivering flesh parted in a long, lingering gash, a spring of blood welled up between the living walls of the wounds, and two thick streams, in opposite directions, coursed down the thigh. The sponges were instantly dipped in the purple pool. Every face present was pinched to a point with suspense. The limb writhed. The man shrieked. His messmates pinioned him, while round and round the leg went the unpitying cut. "The saw," said Cuticle. Instantly it was in his hand. Full of the operation, he was about to apply it, when, looking up and turning to the assistant surgeons, he said, "Would any of you young gentlemen like to apply the saw? A splendid subject." Several volunteered. When, selecting one, Cuticle surrendered the instrument to him, saying, "Don't be hurried now, be steady." While the rest of the assistants looked upon their comrade with glances of envy, he went rather timidly to work, and Cuticle, who was earnestly regarding him, suddenly snatched the saw from his hand. "Away, butcher! You disgrace the profession! Look at me!" For a few moments the thrilling, rasping sound was heard, and then the topman seemed parted in twain at the hip, as the leg slowly slid into the arms of the pale, gaunt man in the shroud, who at once made away with it, and tucked it out of sight under one of the guns. "Surgeon Sawyer," now, said Cuticle, courteously turning to the surgeon of the Mohawk, "would you like to take up the arteries? They are quite at your service, sir." "Do, Sawyer, be prevailed upon," said Surgeon Bandage. Sawyer complied, and while, with some modesty, he was conducting the operation, Cuticle, turning to the row of assistants, said, "Young gentlemen, we will now proceed with our illustration. Hand me that bone, steward." And taking the thigh bone in his still bloody hands, and holding it conspicuously before his auditors, the surgeon of the fleet began. "Young gentlemen, you will perceive that precisely at this spot, here, to which I previously directed your attention, at the corresponding spot precisely, the operation has been performed. About here, young gentlemen, here," lifting his hand some inches from the bone, "about here the great artery was. But you noticed that I did not use the tourniquet. I never do. The forefinger of my steward is far better than a tourniquet, being so much more manageable, and leaving the smaller veins uncompressed. But I have been told, young gentlemen, that a certain Signor Signoroni, a surgeon of Seville, has recently invented an admirable substitute for the clumsy, old-fashioned tourniquet. As I understand it, it is something like a pair of calipers, working with a small Archimedes screw, a very clever invention, according to all accounts. For the padded points at the end of the arches," arching his forefinger and thumb, can be so worked as to approximate in such a way as to— But you don't attend to me, young gentleman," he added all at once, starting. Being more interested in the active proceedings of Surgeon Sawyer, who was now threading a needle to sew up the overlapping of the stump, the young gentleman had not sculpted to turn away their attention altogether from the lecturer. A few moments more, and the topman, in a swoon, was removed below into the sick bay. As the curtain settled again after the patient had disappeared, Cuticle, still holding the thigh bone of the skeleton in his ensanguined hands, proceeded with his remarks upon it, and having concluded them, added, "Now, young gentlemen, not the least interesting consequence of this operation will be the finding of the ball, which, in case of non-amputation, might have long eluded the most careful search. That ball, young gentlemen, must have taken a most circuitous route, nor, in cases where the direction is oblique, is this at all unusual. Indeed, the learned Henner gives us a most remarkable, I had almost said an incredible, case of a soldier's neck, where the bullet, entering at the part called Adam's apple— "Yes," said Surgeon Wedge, elevating himself, "the pomum Adami." "Entering the point called Adam's apple," continued Cuticle, severely emphasizing the last two words, "ran completely round the neck, and, emerging at the same hole it had entered, shot the next man in the ranks. It was afterward extracted," says Renner, "from the second man, and pieces of the other's skin were found adhering to it. But examples of foreign substances being received into the body with a ball, young gentlemen, are frequently observed. Being attached to a United States ship at the time, I happened to be near the spot of the battle of Ayacucho in Peru. The day after the action I saw in the barracks of the wounded a trooper who, having been severely injured in the brain, went crazy, and, with his own holster pistol, committed suicide in the hospital. The ball drove inward a portion of his woolen nightcap." "In the form of a cul-de-sac, doubtless," said the undaunted Wedge. "For once, Surgeon Wedge, you use the only term that can be employed, and let me avail myself of this opportunity to say to you, young gentlemen, that a man of true science," expanding his shallow chest a little, "uses but few hard words, and those only when none other will answer his purpose, whereas the smatterer in science," slightly glancing toward Wedge, "thinks that by mouthing hard words he proves that he understands hard things. Let this sink deep in your minds, young gentlemen, and, Surgeon Wedge," with a stiff bow, "permit me to submit the reflection to yourself. Well, young gentlemen, the bullet was afterward extracted by pulling upon the external parts of the cul-de-sac, a simple but exceedingly beautiful operation. There is a fine example, somewhat similar, related in Guthrie, but of course you must have met with it in so well-known a work as his treatise upon gunshot wounds. When, upward of 20 years ago, I was with Lord Cochrane, then Admiral of the fleets of this very country," pointing shoreward out of a porthole, "a sailor of the vessel to which I was attached during the blockade of Bahia had his leg—" But by this time the fidgets had completely taken possession of his auditors, especially of the senior surgeons, and turning upon them abruptly, he added, "But I will not detain you longer, gentlemen," turning round upon all the surgeons. "Your dinners must be waiting you on board your respective ships. But, Surgeon Sawyer, perhaps you may desire to wash your hands before you go. There is the basin, sir. You will find a clean towel on the rammer. For myself, I seldom use them," taking out his handkerchief. "I must leave you now, gentlemen," bowing. "To-morrow at 10 the limb will be upon the table, and I shall be happy to see you all upon the occasion. Who's there?" turning to the curtain, which then rustled. "Please, sir," said the steward, entering, "the patient is dead." "The body also, gentlemen, at 10 precisely," said Cuticle, once more turning round upon his guests. "I predicted that the operation might prove fatal. He was very much run down. Good morning," and Cuticle departed. "He does not surely mean to touch the body?" exclaimed Surgeon Sawyer with much excitement. "Oh, no," said Patella, "that's only his way. He means, doubtless, that it may be inspected previous to being taken ashore for burial." The assemblage of gold-laced surgeons now ascended to the quarter-deck. The second cutter was called away by the bugler, and, one by one, they were dropped aboard of their respective ships. The following evening, the messmates of the topman rowed his remains ashore, and buried them in the ever-vernal Protestant cemetery, hard by the beach of the Flamingoes, in plain sight from the bay. End of Chapter 63. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 64 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 64. Man of War Trophies. When the second cutter pulled about among the ships, dropping the surgeons aboard the American men of war here and there, as a pilot boat distributes her pilots at the mouth of the harbor, she passed several foreign frigates, two of which, an Englishman and a Frenchman, had excited not a little remark on board the Neversink. These vessels often loosed their sails and exercised yards simultaneously with ourselves, as if desirous of comparing the respective efficiency of the crews. When we were nearly ready for sea, the English frigate, weighing her anchor, made all sail with the sea breeze, and began showing off her paces by gliding about among all the men of war in harbor, and particularly by running down under the Neversink's stern. Every time she drew near, we complimented her by lowering our ensign a little, and invariably she courteously returned the salute. She was inviting us to a sailing match, and it was rumored that, when we should leave the bay, our captain would have no objections to gratify her, for, be it known, the Neversink was accounted the fleetest keeled craft sailing under the American long pennant. Perhaps this was the reason why the stranger challenged us. It may have been that a portion of our crew were the more anxious to race with this frigate, from a little circumstance which a few of them deemed rather galling. Not many cables' length distant from our Commodore's cabin lay the frigate President, with the Red Cross of St. George flying from her peak. As its name imported, this fine craft was an American-born, but having been captured during the last war with Britain, she now sailed the salt seas as a trophy. Think of it, my gallant countrymen, one and all, down the sea-coast and along the endless banks of the Ohio and Columbia. Think of the twinges we sea-patriots must have felt to behold the live oak of the Floridas and the pines of green Maine built into the oaken walls of old England. But, to some of the sailors, there was a counterbalancing thought, as grateful as the other was galling. And that was that somewhere, sailing under the stars and stripes, was the frigate Macedonian, a British-born craft which had once sported the battle banner of Britain. It has ever been the custom to spend almost any amount of money in repairing a captured vessel, in order that she may long survive to commemorate the heroism of the conqueror. Thus, in the English Navy, there are many Monsieurs of 74s won from the Gaul. But we Americans can show but few similar trophies, though, no doubt, we would much like to be able to do so. But I never have beheld any of the floating trophies without being reminded of a scene once witnessed in a pioneer village on the western bank of the Mississippi. Not far from this village, where the stumps of aboriginal trees yet stand in the marketplace, some years ago lived a portion of the remnant tribes of the Sioux Indians, who frequently visited the white settlements to purchase trinkets and cloths. One florid crimson evening in July, when the red-hot sun was going down in a blaze, and I was leaning against a corner in my huntsman's frock, lo, there came stalking out of the crimson west a gigantic red man, erect as a pine, with his glittering tomahawk, big as a broad-axe, folded in martial repose across his chest, Moodily wrapped in his blanket, and striding like a king on the stage, he promenaded up and down the rustic streets, exhibiting on the back of his blanket a crowd of human hands, rudely delineated in red. One of them seemed recently drawn. "Who is this warrior?" asked I, "and why marches he here? And for what are these bloody hands?" "The warrior is the red-hot coal," said a pioneer in moccasins by my side. "He marches here to show off his last trophy. Every one of those hands attests a foe scalped by his tomahawk. And he has just emerged from Ben Brown's, the painter, who has sketched the last red hand that you see. For last night this red-hot coal outburned the yellow torch, the chief of a band of the Foxes." Poor savage, thought I. And is this the cause of your lofty gait? Do you straighten yourself to think that you have committed a murder, when a chance-falling stone has often done the same? Is it a proud thing to topple down 6 feet perpendicular of immortal manhood, though that lofty living tower needed perhaps 30 good growing summers to bring it to maturity? Poor savage! And you account it so glorious, do you, to mutilate and destroy what God himself was more than a quarter of a century in building? And yet, fellow Christians, what is the American frigate Macedonian, or the English frigate President, but as 2 bloody red hands painted on this poor savage's blanket? Are there no Moravians in the moon, that not a missionary has yet visited this poor pagan planet of ours, to civilize civilization and Christianize Christendom? End of chapter 64. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 65 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 65. A Man of War Race. We lay in Rio so long, for what reason the Commodore only knows, that a saying went abroad among the impatient sailors that our frigate would at last ground on the beef bones daily thrown overboard by the cooks. But at last good tidings came. "All hands up, anchor ahoy!" And bright and early in the morning up came our old iron, as the sun rose in the east. The land breezes at Rio, by which alone vessels may emerge from the bay, is ever languid and faint. It comes from gardens of citrons and cloves, spiced with all the spices of the Tropic of Capricorn. And like that old exquisite, Mohammed, who so much loved to snuff perfumes and essences, and used to lounge out of the conservatories of Khadijah, his wife, to give battle to the robust sons of Koresh. Even so, this Rio land breeze comes jaded with sweet-smelling savors, to wrestle with the wild Tartar breezes of the sea. Slowly we dropped and dropped down the bay, glided like a stately swan through the outlet, and were gradually rolled by the smooth, sliding billows broad out upon the deep. Straight in our wake came the tall mainmast of the English fighting frigate, terminating like a steepled cathedral in the bannered cross of the religion of peace. And straight after her came the rainbow banner of France, sporting God's token that no more would he make war on the earth. Both Englishmen and Frenchmen were resolved upon a race, and we Yankees swore by our topsails and royals to sink their blazing banners that night among the southern constellations we should daily be extinguishing behind us in our run to the north. "Aye," said Mad Jack, "St. George's banner shall be as the Southern Cross, out of sight, leagues down the horizon, while our gallant stars, my brave boys, shall burn all alone in the north, like the Great Bear at the pole. Come on, Rainbow and Cross." But the wind was long languid and faint, not yet recovered from its night's dissipation, ashore, and noon advanced, with the Sugarloaf pinnacle in sight. Now, it is not with ships as with horses, for though if a horse walk well and fast, it generally furnishes good token that he is not bad at a gallop, yet the ship that in a light breeze is outstripped may sweep the stakes, so soon as a t'gallant breeze enables her to strike into a canter. Thus fared it with us. First, the Englishman glided ahead, and bluffly passed on. Then the Frenchman politely bade us adieu, while the old Neversink lingered behind, railing at the effeminate breeze. At one time, all three frigates were irregularly abreast, forming a diagonal line, and so near were all three, that the stately officers on the poops stiffly saluted by touching their caps, though refraining from any further civilities. At this juncture, it was a noble sight to behold those fine frigates, with dripping breast-hooks, all rearing and nodding in concert, and to look through their tall spars and wilderness of rigging, that seemed like inextricably entangled gigantic cobwebs against the sky. Towards sundown the ocean pawed its white hoofs to the spur of its helter-skelter rider, a strong blast from the eastward, and, giving three cheers from decks, yards, and tops, we crowded all sail on St. George and St. Denis. But it is harder to overtake than outstrip. Night fell upon us, still in the rear, still where the little boat was, which, at the 11th hour, according to a rabbinical tradition, pushed after the ark of old Noah. It was a misty, cloudy night, and though at first our lookouts kept the chase in dim sight, yet at last so thick became the atmosphere that no sign of a strange spar was to be seen. But the worst of it was that, when last discerned, the Frenchman was broad on our weather bow, and the Englishman gallantly leading his van. The breeze blew fresher and fresher, but, with even our main royal set, we dashed along through a cream-colored ocean of illuminated foam. White Jacket was then in the top, and it was glorious to look down and see our black hull butting the white sea with its broad bows like a ram. "We must beat them with such a breeze, dear Jack," said I to our noble captain of the top. "But the same breeze blows for John Bull, remember," replied Jack, who, being a Briton, perhaps favored the Englishman more than the Neversink. "But how we boom through the billows!" cried Jack, gazing over the top rail. Then, flinging forth his arm, recited, "Aslope, and gliding on the leeward side, the bounding vessel cuts the roaring tide." Camoens, White Jacket, Camoens, did you ever read him? The Lusiad, I mean. It's the man-of-war epic of the world, my lad. Give me Gamma for a Commodore, say I. Noble Gamma. And Michael, White Jacket, did you ever read him? William Julius Michael, Camoens' translator? A disappointed man, though, White Jacket. Besides his version of the Lusiad, he wrote many forgotten things. Did you ever see his ballad of Cumnor Hall? No? Why, it gave Sir Walter Scott the hint of Kenilworth. My father knew Michael when he went to sea on board the old Romney man-of-war. How many great men have been sailors, White Jacket? They say Homer himself was once a tar, even as his hero, Ulysses, was both a sailor and a shipwright. I'll swear Shakespeare was once a captain of the forecastle. Do you mind the first scene in The Tempest, White Jacket? And the world-finder Christopher Columbus was a sailor, and so was Camoens, who went to sea with Gamma, else we had never had the Lusiad, White Jacket. Yes, I've sailed over the very track that Camoens sailed, round the East Cape into the Indian Ocean. I've been in Don Jose's garden, too, in Macao, and bathed my feet in the blessed dew of the walks where Camoens wandered before me. Yes, White Jacket, and I have seen and sat in the cave at the end of the flowery winding way, where Camoens, according to tradition, composed certain parts of his Lusiad. Aye, Camoens was a sailor once. Then there's Falconer, whose shipwreck will never founder, though he himself, poor fellow, was lost at sea in the Aurora frigate. Old Noah was the first sailor. And St. Paul, too, knew how to box the compass, my lad. Mind you, that chapter in Acts? I couldn't spin the yarn better myself. Were you ever in Malta? They called it Melita in the Apostles' day. I have been in Paul's cave there, White Jacket. They say a piece of it is good for a charm against shipwreck, but I never tried it. There's Shelley. He was quite a sailor. Shelley? Poor lad. A Percy, too, but they ought to have let him sleep in his sailor's grave. He was drowned in the Mediterranean, you know, near Leghorn, and not burn his body as they did, as if he had been a bloody Turk. But many people thought him so, White Jacket, because he didn't go to Mass, and because he wrote Queen Mab. Trelawney was by at the burning, and he was an ocean rover, too. Aye, and Byron helped put a piece of a keel on the fire, for it was made of bits of a wreck, they say. One wreck burning another. And was not Byron a sailor, an amateur forecastleman, White Jacket? So he was. Else how bid the ocean heave and fall in that grand, majestic way? I say, White Jacket, d'ye mind me? There never was a very great man yet who spent all his life inland. A snuff of the sea, my boy, is inspiration, and having been once out of sight of land has been the making of many a true poet and the blasting of many pretenders. For, d'ye see, there's no gammon about the ocean. It knocks the false keel right off a pretender's bows. It tells him just what he is, and makes him feel it, too. A sailor's life, I say, is the thing to bring us mortals out. What does the blessed Bible say? Don't it say that we maintopmen alone see the marvelous sights and wonders? Don't deny the blessed Bible, now. Don't do it. How it rocks up here, my boy, holding on to a shroud. But it only proves what I've been saying. The sea is the place to cradle genius. Heave and fall, old sea. And you also, noble Jack, said I. What are you but a sailor? You're merry, my boy, said Jack, looking up with a glance like that of a sentimental archangel doomed to drag out his eternity in disgrace. But mind you, White Jacket, there are many great men in the world besides commodores and captains. I've that here, White Jacket, touching his forehead, which, under happier skies, perhaps in you, solitary star there, peeping down from those clouds, might have made a Homer of me. But fate is fate, White Jacket, and we Homers who happen to be captains of tops must write our odes in our hearts, and publish them in our heads. But look, the captain's on the poop. It was now midnight, but all the officers were on deck. "Jib boom there!" cried the lieutenant of the watch, going forward and hailing the headmost lookout. "D'ye see anything of those fellows now?" "See nothing, sir." "See nothing, sir," said the lieutenant, approaching the captain and touching his cap. "Call all hands," roared the captain. "This keel shan't be beat while I stride it." All hands were called, and the hammocks stowed in the nettings for the rest of the night, so that no one could lie between blankets. Now, in order to explain the means adopted by the captain to ensure us the race, it needs to be said of the Neversink that, for some years after being launched, she was accounted one of the slowest vessels in the American Navy. But it chanced upon a time that, being on a cruise in the Mediterranean, she happened to sail out of Port Mahon, in what was then supposed to be very bad trim for the sea. Her bows were rooting in the water, and her stern kicking up its heels in the air. But, wonderful to tell, it was soon discovered that in this comical posture she sailed like a shooting star. She outstripped every vessel on the station. Thenceforward all her captains on all cruises trimmed her by the head, and the Neversink gained the name of a clipper. To return. All hands being called, they were now made use of by Captain Claret as make-weights to trim the ship scientifically to her most approved bearings. Some were sent forward on the spar-deck with 24-pound shot in their hands, and were judiciously scattered about here and there, with strict orders not to budge an inch from their stations, for fear of marring the captain's plans. Others were distributed along the gun and berth decks with similar orders, and, to crown all, several cannonade guns were unshipped from their carriages and swung in their breechings from the beams of the main deck, so as to impart a sort of vibratory briskness and oscillating buoyancy to the frigate. And thus we 500 make-weights stood out that whole night, some of us exposed to a drenching rain, in order that the Neversink might not be beaten. But the comfort and consolation of all make-weights is as dust in the balance in the estimation of the rulers of our man-of-war world. The long, anxious night at last came to an end, and, with the first peep of day, the lookout on the jib-boom was hailed, but nothing was in sight. At last it was broad day, yet still not a bow was to be seen in our rear, nor a stern in our van. "Where are they?" cried the captain. "Out of sight astern, to be sure, sir," said the officer of the deck. "Out of sight ahead, to be sure, sir," muttered Jack Chase in the top. Precisely thus stood the question. Whether we beat them, or whether they beat us, no mortal can tell to this hour, since we never saw them again. But for one, White Jacket will lay his 2 hands on the bow chasers of the Neversink, and take his ship's oath that we Yankees carried the day. End of chapter 65. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 66 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 66. Fun in a Man of War. After the race, our man-of-war derby, we had many days fine weather, during which we continued running before the trades toward the north. Exhilarated by the thought of being homeward bound, many of the seamen became joyous, and the discipline of the ship, if anything, became a little relaxed. Many pastimes served to while away the dog watches in particular. These dog watches, embracing 2 hours in the early part of the evening, form the only authorized playtime for the crews of most ships at sea. Among other diversions at present licensed by authority in the Neversink were those of single stick, sparring, hammer and anvil, and head bumping. All these were under the direct patronage of the captain; otherwise, seeing the consequences they sometimes led to, they would undoubtedly have been strictly prohibited. It is a curious coincidence that when a navy captain does not happen to be an admirer of the Fistiana, his crew seldom amuse themselves in that way. Single stick, as everyone knows, is a delightful pastime which consists in 2 men standing a few feet apart, and rapping each other over the head with long poles. There is a good deal of fun in it, so long as you are not hit; but a hit, in the judgment of discreet persons, spoils the sport completely. When this pastime is practiced by connoisseurs ashore, they wear heavy wired helmets to break the force of the blows. But the only helmets of our tars were those with which nature had furnished them. They played with great gun-rammers. Sparring consists in playing single stick with bone poles instead of wooden ones. 2 men stand apart and pommel each other with their fists, a hard bunch of knuckles permanently attached to the arms and made globular or extended into a palm at the pleasure of the proprietor, till one of them, finding himself sufficiently thrashed, cries "enough." Hammer and anvil is thus practiced by amateurs. Patient number 1 gets on all fours and stays so, while patient number 2 is taken up by his arms and legs, and his base is swung against the base of patient number 1, till patient number 1, with the force of the final blow, is sent flying along the deck. Head bumping, as patronized by Captain Claret, consists in two negroes, whites will not answer, butting at each other like rams. This pastime was an especial favorite with the captain. In the dog watches, Rosewater and Mayday were repeatedly summoned into the lee waist to tilt at each other for the benefit of the captain's health. Mayday was a full-blooded bull negro, so the sailors called him, with a skull like an iron tea-kettle, wherefore Mayday much fancied the sport. But Rosewater, he was a slender and rather handsome mulatto, and abhorred the pastime. Nevertheless, the captain must be obeyed. So, at the word, poor Rosewater was fain to put himself in a posture of defence, else Mayday would incontinently have bumped him out of a port-hole into the sea. I used to pity poor Rosewater from the bottom of my heart, but my pity was almost aroused into indignation at a sad sequel to one of these gladiatorial scenes. It seems that, lifted up by the unaffected though verbally unexpressed applause of the captain, Mayday had begun to despise Rosewater as a poltroon, a fellow all brains and no skull, whereas he himself was a great warrior, all skull and no brains. Accordingly, after they had been bumping one evening to the captain's content, Mayday confidentially told Rosewater that he considered him a nigger, which among some blacks is held a great term of reproach. Fired at the insult, Rosewater gave Mayday to understand that he utterly erred, for his mother, a black slave, had been one of the mistresses of a Virginia planter belonging to one of the oldest families in that state. Another insulting remark followed this innocent disclosure. Retort followed retort. In a word, at last they came together in mortal combat. The master-at-arms caught them in the act, and brought them up to the mast. The captain advanced. "Please, sir," said poor Rosewater, "it all came of that 'ere bumping. Mayday here aggrawated me about it." "Master-at-arms," said the captain, "did you see them fighting?" "Aye, sir," said the master-at-arms, touching his cap. "Rig the grating," said the captain. "I'll teach you two men that, though I now and then permit you to play, I will have no fighting. Do your duty, boatswain's mate." And the negroes were flogged. Justice commands that the fact of the captain's not showing any leniency to Mayday, a decided favorite of his, at least while in the ring, should not be passed over. He flogged both culprits in the most impartial manner. As in the matter of the scene at the gangway, shortly after the Cape Horn theatricals, when my attention had been directed to the fact that the officers had shipped their quarter-deck faces upon that occasion, I say, it was seen with what facility a sea officer assumes his wonted severity of demeanor after a casual relaxation of it. This was especially the case with Captain Claret upon the present occasion. For any landsman to have beheld him in the lee waist of a pleasant dog-watch, with a genial, good-humoured countenance, observing the gladiators in the ring, and now and then indulging in a playful remark, that landsman would have deemed Captain Claret the indulgent father of his crew, perhaps permitting the excess of his kind-heartedness to encroach upon the appropriate dignity of his station. He would have deemed Captain Claret a fine illustration of those too well-known poetical comparisons between a sea captain and a father, and between a sea captain and the master of apprentices, instituted by those eminent maritime jurists, the noble Lords Tenterden and Stowell. But surely, if there is anything hateful, it is this shipping of the quarter-deck face after wearing a merry and good-natured one. How can they have the heart? Methinks if but once I smiled upon a man, never mind how much beneath me, I could not bring myself to condemn him to the shocking misery of the lash. Oh, officers all around the world, if this quarter-deck face you wear at all, then never unship it for another, to be merely sported for a moment. Of all insults, the temporary condescension of a master to a slave is the most outrageous and galling. That potentate who most condescends, mark him well, for that potentate, if occasion come, will prove your uttermost tyrant. End of chapter 66. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 67 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 67. White Jacket arraigned at the mast. When, with 500 others, I made one of the compelled spectators at the scourging of poor Rosewater, I little thought what fate had ordained for myself the next day. Poor mulatto, thought I, one of an oppressed race, they degrade you like a hound. Thank God I am a white. Yet I had seen whites also scourged, for black or white, all my shipmates were liable to that. Still, there is something in us, somehow, that in the most degraded condition we snatch at a chance to deceive ourselves into a fancied superiority to others, whom we suppose lower in the scale than ourselves. Poor Rosewater, thought I, poor mulatto, heaven send you a release from your humiliation. To make plain the thing about to be related, it needs to repeat what has somewhere been previously mentioned, that in tacking ship, every seaman in a man of war has a particular station assigned him. What that station is should be made known to him by the first lieutenant, and when the word is passed to tack or wear, it is every seaman's duty to be found at his post. But among the various numbers and stations given to me by the senior lieutenant when I first came on board the frigate, he had altogether omitted informing me of my particular place at those times. And, up to the precise period now written of, I had hardly known that I should have had any special place then at all. For the rest of the men, they seemed to me to catch hold of the first rope that offered, as in a merchantman upon similar occasions. Indeed, I subsequently discovered that such was the state of discipline, in this one particular at least, that very few of the seamen could tell where their proper stations were, at tacking or wearing. "All hands tack ship ahoy!" Such was the announcement made by the boatswain's mates at the hatchways the morning after the hard fate of Rosewater. It was just 8 bells, noon, and springing from my white jacket, which I had spread between the guns for a bed on the main deck, I ran up the ladders, and, as usual, seized hold of the main brace, which 50 hands were streaming along forward. When main topsail haul was given through the trumpet, I pulled at this brace with such heartiness and good will that I almost flattered myself that my instrumentality in getting the frigate round on the other tack deserved a public vote of thanks and a silver tankard from Congress. But something happened to be in the way aloft when the yard swung round. A little confusion ensued, and with anger on his brow, Captain Claret came forward to see what occasioned it. No one to let go the weather lift of the main yard. The rope was cast off, however, by a hand, and the yards unobstructed came round. When the last rope was coiled away, the captain desired to know of the first lieutenant who it might be that was stationed at the weather, then the starboard, main lift. With a vexed expression of countenance, the first lieutenant sent a midshipman for the station bill, when, upon glancing it over, my own name was found put down at the post in question. At the time I was on the gun-deck below, and did not know of these proceedings. But a moment after, I heard the boatswain's mates bawling my name at all the hatchways and along all 3 decks. It was the first time I had ever heard it so sent through the furthest recesses of the ship, and well knowing what this generally betokened to other seamen, my heart jumped to my throat, and I hurriedly asked Flute, the boatswain's mate at the fore hatchway, what was wanted of me. "Captain wants ye at the mast," he replied. "Gonna flog ye, I guess." "What for?" "My eyes, you've been chalking your face, ain't ye?" "What am I wanted for?" I repeated. But at that instant my name was again thundered forth by the other boatswain's mate, and Flute hurried me away, hinting that I would soon find out what the captain desired of me. I swallowed down my heart in me as I touched the spar deck, for a single instant balanced myself on my best centre, and then, wholly ignorant of what was going to be alleged against me, advanced to the dread tribunal of the frigate. As I passed through the gangway, I saw the quartermaster rigging the gratings, the boatswain with his green bag of scourges, the master-at-arms ready to help off someone's shirt. Again I made a desperate swallow of my whole soul in me, and found myself standing before Captain Claret. His flushed face obviously showed him in ill humor. Among the group of officers by his side was the first lieutenant, who, as I came aft, eyed me in such a manner that I plainly perceived him to be extremely vexed at me for having been the innocent means of reflecting upon the manner in which he kept up the discipline of the ship. "Why were you not at your station, sir?" asked the captain. "What station do you mean, sir?" said I. It is generally the custom with man-of-war's men to stand obsequiously touching their hat at every sentence they address to the captain. But as this was not obligatory upon me by the Articles of War, I did not do so upon the present occasion, and previously I had never had the dangerous honor of a personal interview with Captain Claret. He quickly noticed my omission of the homage usually rendered him, and instinct told me that, to a certain extent, it set his heart against me. "What station, sir, do you mean?" said I. "You pretend ignorance," he replied. "It will not help you, sir." Glancing at the captain, the first lieutenant now produced the station bill, and read my name in connection with that of the starboard main-lift. "Captain Claret," said I, "it is the first time I ever heard of my being assigned to that post." "How is this, Mr. Bridewell?" he said, turning to the first lieutenant, with a fault-finding expression. "It is impossible, sir," said that officer, striving to hide his vexation. "But this man must have known his station." "I have never known it before this moment, Captain Claret," said I. "Do you contradict my officer?" he returned. "I shall flog you." I had now been on board the frigate upward of a year, and remained unscourged. The ship was homeward bound, and in a few weeks, at most, I would be a free man. And now, after making a hermit of myself in some things in order to avoid the possibility of the scourge, here it was, hanging over me for a thing utterly unforeseen, for a crime of which I was as utterly innocent. But all that was as naught. I saw that my case was hopeless, my solemn disclaimer was thrown in my teeth, and the boatswain's mate stood curling his fingers through the cat. There are times when wild thoughts enter a man's heart, when he seems almost irresponsible for his act and his deed. The captain stood on the weather side of the deck. Sideways, on an unobstructed line with him, was the opening of the lee gangway, where the side ladders are suspended in port. Nothing but a slight bit of sinnate stuff served to rail in this opening, which was cut right down to the level of the captain's feet, showing the far sea beyond. I stood a little to windward of him, and, though he was a large, powerful man, it was certain that a sudden rush against him, along the slanting deck, would infallibly pitch him head foremost into the ocean, though he was so rushed must needs go over with him. My blood seemed clotting in my veins. I felt icy cold at the tips of my fingers, and a dimness was before my eyes. But through that dimness the boatswain's mate, scourge in hand, loomed like a giant, and Captain Claret, and the blue sea seen through the opening at the gangway, showed with an awful vividness. I cannot analyze my heart, though it then stood still within me, but the thing that swayed me to my purpose was not altogether the thought that Captain Claret was about to degrade me, and that I had taken an oath with my soul that he should not. No, I felt my man's manhood so bottomless within me that no word, no blow, no scourge of Captain Claret could cut me deep enough for that. I but swung to an instinct in me, the instinct diffused through all animated nature, the same that prompts even a worm to turn under the heel. Locking souls with him, I meant to drag Captain Claret from this earthly tribunal of his to that of Jehovah, and let him decide between us. No other way could I escape the scourge. Nature has not implanted any power in man that was not meant to be exercised at times, though too often our powers have been abused. The privilege, inborn and inalienable, that every man has of dying himself and inflicting death upon another, was not given to us without a purpose. These are the last resources of an insulted and unendurable existence. "To the grating, sir," said Captain Claret. "Do you hear?" My eye was measuring the distance between him and the sea. "Captain Claret," said a voice advancing from the crowd. I turned to see who this might be, that audaciously interposed at a juncture like this. It was the same remarkably handsome and gentlemanly corporal of marines, Colbrook, who has been previously alluded to in the chapter describing killing time in a man of war. "I know that man," said Colbrook, touching his cap, and speaking in a mild, firm, but extremely deferential manner. "And I know that he would not be found absent from his station if he knew where it was." This speech was almost unprecedented. Seldom or never before had a marine dared to speak to the captain of a frigate in behalf of a seaman at the mast. But there was something so unostentatiously commanding in the calm manner of the man that the captain, though astounded, did not in any way reprimand him. The very unusualness of his interference seemed Colbrook's protection. Taking heart, perhaps, from Colbrook's example, Jack Chase interposed, and, in a manly but carefully respectful manner, in substance repeated the corporal's remark, adding that he had never found me wanting in the top. The captain looked from Chase to Colbrook, and from Colbrook to Chase, one the foremost man among the seamen, the other the foremost man among the soldiers, then all round upon the packed and silent crew, and, as if a slave to fate, though supreme captain of a frigate, he turned to the first lieutenant, made some indifferent remark, and saying to me, "You may go," sauntered aft into his cabin; while I, who, in the desperation of my soul, had but just escaped being a murderer and a suicide, almost burst into tears of thanksgiving where I stood. End of chapter 67. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 68 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 68. A Man of War Fountain, and Other Things. Let us forget the scourge and the gangway a while, and jot down in our memories a few little things pertaining to our man-of-war world. I let nothing slip, however small, and feel myself actuated by the same motive which has prompted many worthy old chroniclers to set down the merest trifles concerning things that are destined to pass away entirely from the earth, and which, if not preserved in the nick of time, must infallibly perish from the memories of man. Who knows that this humble narrative may not hereafter prove the history of an obsolete barbarism? Who knows that, when men of war shall be no more, White Jacket may not be quoted to show to the people in the millennium what a man of war was? God hasten the time. Lo, ye years escort it hither, and bless our eyes ere we die. There is no part of a frigate where you will see more going and coming of strangers, and overhear more greetings and gossipings of acquaintances, than in the immediate vicinity of the scuttle-butt, just forward of the main hatchway on the gun-deck. The scuttle-butt is a goodly round painted cask, standing on end, and with its upper head removed, showing a narrow circular shelf within, where rest a number of tin cups for the accommodation of drinkers. Central within the scuttle-butt itself stands an iron pump, which, connecting with the immense water tanks in the hold, furnishes an unfailing supply of the much-admired pale ale, first brewed in the brooks of the Garden of Eden, and stamped with the brand of our old father Adam, who never knew what wine was. We are indebted to the old vintner Noah for that. The scuttle-butt is the only fountain in the ship, and here alone can you drink unless at your meals. Night and day an armed sentry paces before it, bayonet in hand, to see that no water is taken away except according to law. I wonder that they station no sentries at the portholes to see that no air is breathed, except according to Navy regulations. As 500 men come to drink at this scuttle-butt, as it is often surrounded by officers' servants drawing water for their masters to wash, by the cooks of the range, who hither come to fill their coffee-pots, and by the cooks of the ship's messes to procure water for their duffs, the scuttle-butt may be denominated the town pump of the ship, and would that my fine countryman Hawthorne of Salem had but served on board a man-of-war in his time, that he might give us the reading of a rill from the scuttle-butt. As in all extensive establishments, abbeys, arsenals, colleges, treasuries, metropolitan post offices, and monasteries, there are many snug little niches, wherein are ensconced certain superannuated old pensioner officials, and, more especially, as in most ecclesiastical establishments, a few choice prebendary stalls are to be found, furnished with well-filled mangers and racks. So, in a man-of-war, there are a variety of similar snuggeries for the benefit of decrepit or rheumatic old tars. Chief among these is the office of mastman. There is a stout rail on deck at the base of each mast, where a number of braces, lifts, and bunt-lines are belayed to the pins. It is the sole duty of the mastman to see that these ropes are always kept clear, to preserve his premises in a state of the greatest attainable neatness, and every Sunday morning to dispose his ropes in neat Flemish coils. The main mastman of the Neversink was a very aged seaman, who well deserved his comfortable berth. He had seen more than half a century of the most active service, and through all had proved himself a good and faithful man. He furnished one of the very rare examples of a sailor in a green old age, for with most sailors old age comes in youth, and hardship and vice carry them on an early bier to the grave. As in the evening of life, and at the close of the day, old Abraham sat at the door of his tent, biding his time to die, so sits our old mastman on the coat of the mast, glancing round him with patriarchal benignity, and that mild expression of his sets off very strangely a face that has been burned almost black by the torrid suns that shone 50 years ago, a face that is seamed with 3 sabre cuts. You would almost think this old mastman had been blown out of Vesuvius to look alone at his scarred, blackened forehead, chin, and cheeks. But gaze down into his eye, and though all the snows of time have drifted higher and higher upon his brow, yet deep down in that eye you behold an infantile, sinless look, the same that answered the glance of this old man's mother when first she cried for the babe to be laid by her side. That look is the fadeless, ever infantile immortality within. The Lord Nelsons of the sea, though but barons in the state, yet oftentimes prove more potent than their royal masters, and at such scenes as Trafalgar, dethroning this emperor and reinstating that, enact on the ocean the proud part of mighty Richard Neville, the king-making earl of the land. And as Richard Neville entrenched himself in his moated old man-of-war castle of Warwick, which underground was traversed with vaults hewn out of the solid rock and intricate as the wards of the old keys of Calais surrendered to Edward III, even so do these King Commodores house themselves in their water-rimmed, cannon-sentried frigates, oaken dug, deck under deck, as cell under cell. And as the old middle-aged warders of Warwick every night at curfew patrolled the battlements and dove down into the vaults to see that all lights were extinguished, even so do the master-at-arms and ship's corporals of a frigate preamble all the decks of a man-of-war, blowing out all tapers but those burning in the legalized battle-lanterns. Yea, in these things, so potent is the authority of these sea-wardens that, though almost the lowest subalterns in the ship, yet should they find the senior lieutenant himself sitting up late in his state-room, reading Bowditch's Navigator, or Danton on gunpowder and firearms, they would infallibly blow the light out under his very nose, nor durst that Grand Vizier resent the indignity. But, unwittingly, I have ennobled, by grand historical comparisons, this prying, pettifogging, Irish informer of a master-at-arms. You have seen some slim, slipshod housekeeper at midnight ferreting over a rambling old house in the country, startling at fancied witches and ghosts, yet intent on seeing every door bolted, every smouldering ember in the fireplaces smothered, every loitering domestic abed, and every light made dark. This is the master-at-arms, taking his night rounds in a frigate. It may be thought that but little is seen of the Commodore in these chapters, and that, since he so seldom appears on the stage, he cannot be so august a personage after all. But the mightiest potentates keep the most behind the veil. You might tarry in Constantinople a month, and never catch a glimpse of the Sultan. The Grand Lama of Tibet, according to some accounts, is never beheld by the people. But if anyone doubts the majesty of a Commodore, let him know that, according to 42 of the Articles of War, he is invested with a prerogative which, according to monarchical jurists, is inseparable from the throne, the plenary pardoning power. He may pardon all offenses committed in the squadron under his command. But this prerogative is only his while at sea, or on a foreign station, a circumstance peculiarly significant of the great difference between the stately absolutism of a Commodore enthroned on his poop in a foreign harbor, and an unlaced Commodore negligently reclining in an easy-chair in the bosom of his family at home. End of Chapter 68. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 69 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 69. Prayers at the Guns. The training days, or general quarters, now and then taking place in our frigate have already been described, also the Sunday devotions on the half-deck. But nothing has yet been said concerning the daily morning and evening quarters, when the men silently stand at their guns, and the chaplain simply offers up a prayer. Let us now enlarge upon this matter. We have plenty of time, the occasion invites, for, behold, the homeward-bound Neversink bowls along over a jubilant sea. Shortly after breakfast, the drum beats to quarters, and among 500 men, scattered over all 3 decks, and engaged in all manner of ways, That sudden rolling march is magical as the monitory sound to which every good Mussulman at sunset drops to the ground whatsoever his hands might have found to do, and, throughout all Turkey, the people in concert kneel toward their holy Mecca. The sailors run to and fro, some up the deck ladders, some down, to gain their respective stations in the shortest possible time. In 3 minutes all is composed. One by one, the various officers stationed over the separate divisions of the ship then approach the First Lieutenant on the quarter-deck, and report their respective men at their quarters. It is curious to watch their countenances at this time. A profound silence prevails, and emerging through the hatchway from one of the lower decks, a slender young officer appears, hugging his sword to his thigh, and advances through the long lanes of sailors at their guns, his serious eye all the time fixed upon the First Lieutenant's, his polar star. Sometimes he essays a stately and graduated step, an erect and martial bearing, and seems full of the vast national importance of what he is about to communicate. But when at last he gains his destination, you are amazed to perceive that all he has to say is imparted by a Freemason touch of his cap, and a bow. He then turns and makes off to his division, perhaps passing several brother lieutenants, all bound on the same errand he himself has just achieved. For about 5 minutes, these officers are coming and going, bringing in thrilling intelligence from all quarters of the frigate, most stoically received, however, by the First Lieutenant. With his legs apart, so as to give a broad foundation for the superstructure of his dignity, this gentleman stands stiff as a pike-staff on the quarter-deck. One hand holds his sabre, an appurtenance altogether unnecessary at the time, and which he accordingly tucks, point backward, under his arm, like an umbrella, on a sunshiny day. The other hand is continually bobbing up and down to the leather front of his cap, in response to the reports and salute of his subordinates, to whom he never deigns to vouchsafe a syllable, merely going through the motions of accepting their news, without bestowing thanks for their pains. This continual touching of caps between officers on board a man-of-war is the reason why you invariably notice that the glazed fronts of their caps look jaded, lackluster, and worn. Sometimes slightly oleaginous, though in other respects the cap may appear glossy and fresh. But as for the First Lieutenant, he ought to have extra pay allowed to him, on account of his extraordinary outlays in cap fronts, for he it is to whom, all day long, reports of various kinds are incessantly being made by the junior lieutenants, and no report is made by them, however trivial, but caps are touched on the occasion. It is obvious that these individual salutes must be greatly multiplied and aggregated upon the senior lieutenant, who must return them all. Indeed, when a subordinate officer is first promoted to that rank, he generally complains of the same exhaustion about the shoulder and elbow that Lafayette mourned over, when, in visiting America, he did little else but shake the sturdy hands of patriotic farmers from sunrise to sunset. The various officers of divisions having presented their respects and made good their return to their stations, the First Lieutenant turns round and, marching aft, endeavors to catch the eye of the captain, in order to touch his own cap to that personage, and thereby, without adding a word of explanation, communicate the fact of all hands being at their guns. He is a sort of retort, or receiver general, to concentrate the whole sum of the information imparted to him, and discharge it upon his superior at one touch of his cap front. But sometimes the captain feels out of sorts, or in ill humor, or is pleased to be somewhat capricious, or has a fancy to show a touch of his omnipotent supremacy, or, peradventure, it has so happened that the First Lieutenant has, in some way, piqued or offended him, and he is not unwilling to show a slight specimen of his dominion over him, even before the eyes of all hands. At all events, only by some one of these suppositions can the singular circumstance be accounted for, that frequently Captain Claret would pertinaciously promenade up and down the poop, purposely averting his eye from the First Lieutenant, who would stand below in the most awkward suspense, waiting the first wink from his superior's eye. "Now I have him," he must have said to himself as the captain would turn toward him in his walk. "Now's my time," and up would go his hand to his cap. But alas, the captain was off again, and the men at the guns would cast sly winks at each other as the embarrassed lieutenant would bite his lips with suppressed vexation. Upon some occasions, this scene would be repeated several times, till at last Captain Claret, thinking that in the eyes of all hands his dignity must by this time be pretty well bolstered, would stalk towards his subordinate, looking him full in the eyes; whereupon up goes his hand to the cap front, and the captain, nodding his acceptance of the report, descends from his perch to the quarter-deck. By this time the stately Commodore slowly emerges from his cabin, and soon stands leaning alone against the brass rails of the after hatchway. In passing him, the captain makes a profound salutation, which his superior returns, in token that the captain is at perfect liberty to proceed with the ceremonies of the hour. Marching on, Captain Claret at last halts near the mainmast, at the head of a group of the ward-room officers, and by the side of the chaplain. At a sign from his finger, the brass band strikes up the Portuguese hymn. This over, from Commodore to hammock boy, all hands uncover, and the chaplain reads a prayer. Upon its conclusion, the drum beats the retreat, and the ship's company disappear from the guns. At sea or in harbor, this ceremony is repeated every morning and evening. By those stationed on the quarter-deck, the chaplain is distinctly heard, but the quarter-deck gun division embraces but a tenth part of the ship's company, many of whom are below, on the main deck, where not one syllable of the prayer can be heard. This seemed a great misfortune, for I well knew myself how blessed and soothing it was to mingle twice every day in these peaceful devotions, and with the Commodore and Captain and smallest boy unite in acknowledging Almighty God. There was also a touch of the temporary equality of the church about it, exceedingly grateful to a man-of-war's man like me. My carronade gun happened to be directly opposite the brass railing against which the Commodore invariably leaned at prayers. Brought so close together, twice every day, for more than a year, we could not but become intimately acquainted with each other's faces. To this fortunate circumstance it is to be ascribed, that some time after reaching home, we were able to recognize each other when we chanced to meet in Washington, at a ball given by the Russian minister, the Baron de Bodisco. And though, while on board the frigate, the Commodore never in any manner personally addressed me, nor did I him, yet, at the minister's social entertainment, we there became exceedingly chatty. Nor did I fail to observe, among that crowd of foreign dignitaries and magnates from all parts of America, that my worthy friend did not appear so exalted as when leaning, in solitary state, against the brass railing of the Neversink's quarter-deck. Like many other gentlemen, he appeared to the best advantage, and was treated with the most deference in the bosom of his home, the frigate. Our morning and evening quarters were agreeably diversified for some weeks by a little circumstance, which, to some of us at least, always seemed very pleasing. At Callao, half of the Commodore's cabin had been hospitably yielded to the family of a certain aristocratic-looking magnate, who was going ambassador from Peru to the court of the Brazils at Rio. This dignified diplomatist sported a long, twirling mustache that almost enveloped his mouth. The sailors said he looked like a rat with his teeth through a bunch of oakum, or a St. Iago monkey peeping through a prickly pear bush. He was accompanied by a very beautiful wife, and a still more beautiful little daughter about 6 years old. Between this dark-eyed little gypsy and our chaplain there soon sprung up a cordial love and good feeling, so much so that they were seldom apart. And whenever the drum beat to quarters, and the sailors were hurrying to their stations, this little señorita would outrun them all to gain her own quarters at the capstan, where she would stand by the chaplain's side, grasping his hand and looking up archly in his face. It was a sweet relief from the domineering sternness of our martial discipline, a sternness not relaxed even at our devotions before the altar of the common God of Commodore and cabin boy, to see that lovely little girl standing among the 32-pounders, and now and then casting a wondering, commiserating glance at the array of grim seamen around her. End of Chapter 69. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 70 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 70. Monthly Muster Round the Capstan. Besides general quarters, and the regular morning and evening quarters for prayers on board the Neversink, on the first Sunday of every month we had a grand muster round the capstan, when we passed in solemn review before the captain and officers, who closely scanned our frocks and trousers to see whether they were according to the navy cut. In some ships, every man is required to bring his bag and hammock along for inspection. This ceremony requires its chief solemnity, and to a novice is rendered even terrible by the reading of the Articles of War by the captain's clerk before the assembled ship's company, who, in testimony of their enforced reverence for the code, stand bareheaded till the last sentence is pronounced. To a mere amateur reader, the quiet perusal of these Articles of War would be attended with some nervous emotions. Imagine, then, what my feelings must have been, when, with my hat deferentially in my hand, I stood before my lord and master, Captain Claret, and heard these articles read as the law and gospel, the infallible, unappealable dispensation and code whereby I lived and moved and had my being on board of the United States ship Neversink. Of some 20 offenses made penal that a seaman may commit, and which are specified in this code, 13 are punishable by death. Shall suffer death. This was the burden of nearly every article read by the captain's clerk, for he seemed to have been instructed to omit the longer articles, and only present those which were brief and to the point. Shall suffer death. The repeated announcement falls on your ear like the intermitting discharge of artillery. After it has been repeated again and again, you listen to the reader as he deliberately begins a new paragraph. You hear him reciting the involved but comprehensive and clear arrangement of the sentence, detailing all possible particulars of the offense described, and you breathlessly await whether that clause also is going to be concluded by the discharge of the terrible minute-gun, when, lo, it again booms on your ear, shall suffer death. No reservations, no contingencies, not the remotest promise of pardon or reprieve, not a glimpse of commutation of the sentence, all hope and consolation is shut out. Shall suffer death. That is the simple fact for you to digest, and it is a tougher morsel, believe White Jacket when he says it, than a 42-pound cannon ball. But there is a glimmering of an alternative to the sailor who infringes these articles. Some of them thus terminates, "shall suffer death," or "such punishment as a court-martial shall adjudge." But hints this at a penalty still more serious? Perhaps it means death, or worse punishment. Your honors of the Spanish Inquisition, Loyola, and Torquemada, produce, reverend gentlemen, your most secret code, and match these articles of war, if you can. Jack Ketch, you also are experienced in these things. Thou most benevolent of mortals, who standest by us and hangest round our necks when all the rest of this world are against us, tell us, hangman, what punishment is this, horribly hinted at as being worse than death? Is it upon an empty stomach to read the articles of war every morning for the term of one's natural life? Or is it to be imprisoned in a cell, with its walls papered from floor to ceiling with printed copies, in italics, of these articles of war? But it needs not to dilate upon the pure, bubbling milk of human kindness and Christian charity and forgiveness of injuries which pervade this charming document, so thoroughly imbued as a Christian code with the benignant spirit of the Sermon on the Mount. But as it is very nearly alike in the foremost states of Christendom, and as it is nationally set forth by those states, it indirectly becomes an index to the true condition of the present civilization of the world. As, month after month, I would stand bareheaded among my shipmates and hear this document read, I have thought to myself, well, well, White Jacket, you are in a sad box indeed. But prick your ears, there goes another minute-gun. It admonishes you to take all bad usage in good part, and never to join in any public meeting that may be held on the gun-deck for a redress of grievances. Listen. Article 13. If any person in the Navy shall make, or attempt to make, any mutinous assembly, he shall, on conviction thereof by a court-martial, suffer death. Bless me, White Jacket, are you a great gun yourself, that you so recoil to the extremity of your breechings at that discharge? But give ear again. Here goes another minute-gun. It indirectly admonishes you to receive the grossest insult, and stand still under it. Article 14. No private in the Navy shall disobey the lawful orders of his superior officer, or strike him, or draw, or offer to draw, or raise any weapon against him while in the execution of the duties of his office, on pain of death. Do not hang back there by the bulwarks, White Jacket. Come up to the mark once more, for here goes still another minute-gun, which admonishes you never to be caught napping. Part of Article 20. If any person in the Navy shall sleep upon his watch, he shall suffer death. Murderous. But then, in time of peace, they do not enforce these bloodthirsty laws? Do they not, indeed? What happened to those 3 sailors on board an American armed vessel a few years ago, quite within your memory, White Jacket? Yea, while you yourself were yet serving on board this very frigate, the Neversink. What happened to those 3 Americans, White Jacket, those 3 sailors, even as you, who once were alive, but now are dead? Shall suffer death. Those were the 3 words that hung those 3 sailors. Have a care, then, have a care, lest you come to a sad end, even the end of a rope, lest, with a black and blue throat, you turn a dumb diver after pearl shells, put to bed forever, and tucked in your own hammock, at the bottom of the sea. And there you will lie, White Jacket, while hostile navies are playing cannonball billiards over your grave. By the mainmast, then, in a time of profound peace I am subject to the cutthroat martial law, and when my own brother, who happens to be dwelling ashore, and does not serve his country as I am now doing, when he is at liberty to call personally upon the President of the United States and express his disapprobation of the whole national administration, here am I, liable at any time to be run up at the yard-arm with a necklace made by no jeweler round my neck. A hard case, truly, White Jacket, but it cannot be helped. Yes, you live under this same martial law. Does not everything around you din the fact in your ears? Twice every day do you not jump to your quarters at the sound of a drum? Every morning, in port, are you not roused from your hammock by the reveille, and sent to it again at nightfall by the tattoo? Every Sunday, are you not commanded in the mere matter of the very dress you shall wear through that blessed day? Can your shipmates so much as drink their tot of grog? Nay, can they even drink but a cup of water at the scuttle-butt without an armed sentry standing over them? Does not every officer wear a sword instead of a cane? You live and move among 24-pounders. White Jacket, the very cannon-balls are deemed an ornament around you, serving to embellish the hatchways, and should you come to die at sea, White Jacket, still 2 cannon-balls would bear you company when you would be committed to the deep. Yea, by all methods and devices and inventions, you are momentarily admonished of the fact that you live under the Articles of War, and by virtue of them it is, White Jacket, that without a hearing and without a trial you may, at a wink from the captain, be condemned to the scourge. Speak you true? Then let me fly. Nay, White Jacket, the landless horizon hoops you in. Some tempest, then, surge all the sea against us. Hidden reefs and rocks, arise and dash the ships to chips. I was not born a serf, and will not live a slave. Quick, corkscrew whirlpool, suck us down, world's end whelm us. Nay, White Jacket, though this frigate laid her broken bones upon the Antarctic shores of Palmer's Land, though not 2 planks adhered, though all her guns were spiked by swordfish blades, and at her yawning hatchways mouth-yawning sharks swam in and out, yet should you escape the wreck and scramble to the beach, this martial law would meet you still, and snatch you by the throat. Hark. Article 42, part of Section 3. In all cases where the crews of the ships or vessels of the United States shall be separated from their vessels by the latter being wrecked, lost, or destroyed, all the command, power, and authority given to the officers of such ships or vessels shall remain, and be in full force, as effectually as if such ship or vessel were not so wrecked, lost, or destroyed. Hear you that, White Jacket? I tell you there is no escape. Afloat or wrecked, the martial law relaxes not its gripe. And though, by that self-same warrant, for some offence therein set down, you were indeed to suffer death, even then the martial law might hunt you straight through the other world, and out again at its other end, following you through all eternity, like an endless thread on the inevitable track of its own point, passing unnumbered needles through. End of Chapter 70. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 71 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 71. The Genealogy of the Articles of War. As the Articles of War form the ark and constitution of the penal laws of the American Navy, in all sobriety and earnestness, it may be well to glance at their origin. Whence came they? And how is it that one arm of the national defenses of a republic comes to be ruled by a Turkish code, whose every section almost, like each of the tubes of a revolving pistol, fires nothing short of death into the heart of an offender? How comes it that, by virtue of a law solemnly ratified by a Congress of freemen, the representatives of freemen, thousands of Americans are subjected to the most despotic usages, and from the dockyards of a republic absolute monarchies are launched, with the glorious stars and stripes for an ensign? By what unparalleled anomaly, by what monstrous grafting of tyranny upon freedom, did these Articles of War ever come to be so much as heard of in the American Navy? Whence came they? They cannot be the indigenous growth of those political institutions, which are based upon that arch-democrat Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. No. They are an importation from abroad, even from Britain, whose laws we Americans hurled off as tyrannical, and yet retain the most tyrannical of all. But we stop not here, for these Articles of War had their congenial origin in a period of the history of Britain when the Puritan Republic had yielded to a monarchy restored, when a hangman, Judge Jeffreys, sentenced a world's champion like Algernon Sidney to the block, when one of a race by some deemed accursed of God, even a Stuart, was on the throne. And a Stuart also was at the head of the Navy, as Lord High Admiral. One, the son of a king beheaded for encroachments upon the rights of his people, and the other, his own brother, afterward a king, James II, who was hurled from the throne for his tyranny. This is the origin of the Articles of War, and it carries with it an unmistakable clue to their despotism. Footnote: the first naval Articles of War in the English language were passed in the 13th year of the reign of Charles II, under the title of An Act for Establishing Articles and Orders for the Regulating and Better Government of His Majesty's Navies, Ships of War, and Forces by Sea. This act was repealed, and, so far as concerned the officers, a modification of it, substituted in the 22nd year of the reign of George II, shortly after the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, just 1 century ago. This last act, it is believed, comprises in substance the Articles of War at this day in force in the British Navy. It is not a little curious, nor without meaning, that neither of these acts explicitly empowers an officer to inflict the lash. It would almost seem as if, in this case, the British lawgivers were willing to leave such a stigma out of an organic statute, and bestow the power of the lash in some less solemn, and perhaps less public manner. Indeed, the only broad enactments directly sanctioning naval scourging at sea are to be found in the United States Statute Book and in the sea laws of the absolute monarch Louis le Grand of France. Taking for their basis the above-mentioned British Naval Code, and engrafting upon it the positive scourging laws, which Britain was loath to recognize as organic statutes, our American lawgivers, in the year 1800, framed the Articles of War now governing the American Navy. They may be found in the second volume of the United States Statutes at Large, under Chapter 33, an Act for the Better Government of the Navy of the United States, For reference to the latter, Les Ordonnances de la Marine, vide Curtis's Treatise on the Rights and Duties of Merchant Seamen, according to the General Maritime Law, Part 2, Section C.1. End of footnote. Nor is it a dumb thing that the men who, in democratic Cromwell's time, first proved to the nations the toughness of the British oak and the hardihood of the British sailor, that in Cromwell's time, whose fleets struck terror into the cruisers of France, Spain, Portugal, and Holland, and the corsairs of Algiers and the Levant, in Cromwell's time, when Robert Blake swept the narrow seas of all the keels of a Dutch admiral who insultingly carried a broom at his foremast, it is not a dumb thing that, at a period deemed so glorious to the British Navy, these articles of war were unknown. Nevertheless, it is granted that some laws or other must have governed Blake's sailors at that period, but they must have been far less severe than those laid down in the written code which superseded them, since, according to the father-in-law of James II., the historian of the rebellion, the English Navy, prior to the enforcement of the new code, was full of officers and sailors who, of all men, were the most republican. Moreover, the same author informs us that the first work undertaken by his respected son-in-law, then Duke of York, upon entering on the duties of Lord High Admiral, was to have a grand rechristening of the men of war, which still carried on their sterns names too democratic to suit his high Tory ears. But if these articles of war were unknown in Blake's time, and also during the most brilliant period of Admiral Benbow's career, what inference must follow? That such tyrannical ordinances are not indispensable, even during war, to the highest possible efficiency of a military marine. End of Chapter 71. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 72 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 72. Herein are the good ordinances of the sea, which wise men who voyaged round the world gave to our ancestors, and which constitute the books of the science of good customs. The Consulate of the Sea. The present usages of the American Navy are such that, though there is no government enactment to that effect, yet, in many respects, its commanders seem virtually invested with the power to observe or violate, as seems to them fit, several of the Articles of War. According to Article 15, no person in the Navy shall quarrel with any other person in the Navy, nor use provoking or reproachful words, gestures, or menaces, on pain of such punishment as a court-martial shall adjudge. Provoking or reproachful words? Officers of the Navy, answer me. Have you not, many of you, 1,000 times violated this law, and addressed to men whose tongues were tied by this very article, language which no landsman would ever hearken to without flying at the throat of his insulter? I know that worse words than you ever used are to be heard addressed by a merchant captain to his crew, but the merchant captain does not live under this 15th Article of War. Not to make an example of him, nor to gratify any personal feeling, but to furnish one certain illustration of what is here asserted, I honestly declare that Captain Claret of the Neversink repeatedly violated this law in his own proper person. According to Article 3, no officer or other person in the Navy shall be guilty of oppression, fraud, profane swearing, drunkenness, or any other scandalous conduct. Again, let me ask you, officers of the Navy, whether many of you have not repeatedly, and in more than one particular, violated this law. And here, again, as a certain illustration, I must once more cite Captain Claret as an offender, especially in the matter of profane swearing. I must also cite 4 of the lieutenants, some 8 of the midshipmen, and nearly all the seamen. Additional articles might be quoted that are habitually violated by the officers, while nearly all those exclusively referring to the sailors are unscrupulously enforced. Yet those articles by which the sailor is scourged at the gangway are not one whit more laws than those other articles, binding upon the officers, that have become obsolete from immemorial disuse, while still other articles, to which the sailors alone are obnoxious, are observed or violated at the caprice of the captain. Now, if it be not so much the severity as the certainty of punishment that deters from transgression, how fatal to all proper reverence for the enactments of Congress must be this disregard of its statutes. Still more, this violation of the law on the part of the officers in many cases involves oppression to the sailor. But throughout the whole naval code, which so hems in the mariner by law upon law, and which invests the captain with so much judicial and administrative authority over him, in most cases entirely discretionary, not one solitary clause is to be found which in any way provides means for a seaman deeming himself aggrieved to obtain redress. Indeed, both the written and unwritten laws of the American Navy are as destitute of individual guarantees to the mass of seamen as the statute book of the despotic empire of Russia. Who put this great gulf between the American captain and the American sailor? Or is the captain a creature of like passions with ourselves? Or is he an infallible archangel, incapable of the shadow of error? Or has a sailor no mark of humanity, no attribute of manhood, that, bound hand and foot, he is cast into an American frigate shorn of all rights and defenses, while the notorious lawlessness of the commander has passed into a proverb familiar to man-of-war's men: the law was not made for the captain. Indeed, he may almost be said to put off the citizen when he touches his quarter-deck, and, almost exempt from the law of the land himself, he comes down upon others with a judicial severity unknown on the national soil. With the Articles of War in one hand, and the cat-o'-nine-tails in the other, he stands an undignified parody upon Mohammed enforcing Moslemism with the sword and the Koran. The concluding sections of the Articles of War treat of the naval courts-martial before which officers are tried for serious offenses as well as the seamen. The oath administered to members of these courts, which sometimes sit upon matters of life and death, explicitly enjoins that the members shall not at any time divulge the vote or opinion of any particular member of the court, unless required so to do before a court of justice in due course of law. Here, then, is a council of 10, and a star-chamber indeed. Remember also that though the sailor is sometimes tried for his life before a tribunal like this, in no case do his fellow sailors, his peers, form part of the court. Yet that a man should be tried by his peers is the fundamental principle of all civilized jurisprudence. And not only tried by his peers, but his peers must be unanimous to render a verdict, whereas in a court-martial the concurrence of a majority of conventional and social superiors is all that is requisite. In the English Navy, it is said, they had a law which authorized the sailor to appeal, if he chose, from the decision of the captain, even in a comparatively trivial case, to the higher tribunal of a court-martial. It was an English seaman who related this to me. When I said that such a law must be a fatal clog to the exercise of the penal power in the captain, he, in substance, told me the following story. A topman, guilty of drunkenness, being sent to the gratings, and the scourge about to be inflicted, he turned round and demanded a court-martial. The captain smiled and ordered him to be taken down and put into the brig. There he was kept in irons some weeks, when, despairing of being liberated, he offered to compromise at 24 lashes. "Sick of your bargain, then, are you?" said the captain. "No, no, a court-martial you demanded, and a court-martial you shall have." Being at last tried before the bar of quarter-deck officers, he was condemned to 200 lashes. What for? For his having been drunk? No. For his having had the insolence to appeal from an authority, in maintaining which the men who tried and condemned him had so strong a sympathetic interest. Whether this story be wholly true or not, or whether the particular law involved prevails, or ever did prevail in the English Navy, the thing, nevertheless, illustrates the ideas that man-of-war's men themselves have touching the tribunals in question. What can be expected from a court whose deeds are done in the darkness of the recluse courts of the Spanish Inquisition, when that darkness is solemnized by an oath on the Bible, when an oligarchy of epaulets sits upon the bench, and a plebeian topman, without a jury, stands judicially naked at the bar? In view of these things, and especially in view of the fact that, in several cases, the degree of punishment inflicted upon a man-of-war's man is absolutely left to the discretion of the court, what shame should American legislators take to themselves, that with perfect truth we may apply to the entire body of the American man-of-war's men that infallible principle of Sir Edward Coke: "It is one of the genuine marks of servitude to have the law either concealed or precarious." But still better may we subscribe to the saying of Sir Matthew Hale, in his History of the Common Law, that the martial law, being based upon no settled principles, is, in truth and reality, no law, but something indulged rather than allowed as a law. I know it may be said that the whole nature of this naval code is purposely adapted to the war exigencies of the Navy. But waiving the grave question that might be raised concerning the moral, not judicial, lawfulness of this arbitrary code, even in time of war, be it asked, why it is in force during a time of peace? The United States has now existed as a nation upward of 70 years, and in all that time the alleged necessity for the operation of the naval code, in cases deemed capital, has only existed during a period of 2 or 3 years at most. Some may urge that the severest operations of the code are tacitly made dull in time of peace, but though with respect to several of the articles this holds true, yet at any time any and all of them may be legally enforced. Nor have there been wanting recent instances illustrating the spirit of this code, even in cases where the letter of the code was not altogether observed. The well-known case of a United States brig furnishes a memorable example, which at any moment may be repeated. 3 men, in a time of peace, were then hung at the yard-arm, merely because, in the captain's judgment, it became necessary to hang them. To this day, the question of their complete guilt is socially discussed. How shall we characterize such a deed? Says Blackstone, If any one that hath commission of martial authority doth in time of peace hang or otherwise execute any man by color of martial law, this is murder, for it is against Magna Carta. Commentaries, section B1 and C13. Magna Carta. We moderns, who may be landsmen, may justly boast of civil immunities not possessed by our forefathers, but our remoter forefathers, who happened to be mariners, may straighten themselves even in their ashes to think that their lawgivers were wiser and more humane in their generation than our lawgivers in ours. Compare the sea laws of our navy with the Roman and Rhodian ocean ordinances. Compare them with the consulate of the sea. Compare them with the laws of the Hansa towns. Compare them with the ancient Weisbury laws. In the last we find that they were ocean democrats in those days. If he strikes, he ought to receive blow for blow. Thus speak out the Weisbury laws concerning a Gothland sea captain. In final reference to all that has been said in previous chapters touching the severity and usualness of the laws of the American Navy, and the large authority vested in its commanding officers, be it here observed that White Jacket is not unaware of the fact that the responsibility of an officer commanding at sea, whether in the merchant service or the national marine, is unparalleled by that of any other relation in which man may stand to man. Nor is he unmindful that both wisdom and humanity dictate that, from the peculiarity of his position, a sea officer in command should be clothed with a degree of authority and discretion inadmissible in any master ashore. But at the same time, these principles, recognized by all writers on maritime law, have undoubtedly furnished warrant for clothing modern sea commanders and naval courts-martial with powers which exceed the due limits of reason and necessity. Nor is this the only instance where right and salutary principles, in themselves almost self-evident and infallible, have been advanced in justification of things which in themselves are just as self-evidently wrong and pernicious. Be it here, once and for all, understood that no sentimental and theoretic love for the common sailor, no romantic belief in that peculiar noble-heartedness and exaggerated generosity of disposition fictitiously imputed to him in novels, and no prevailing desire to gain the reputation of being his friend, have actuated me in anything I have said, in any part of this work, touching the gross oppression under which I know that the sailors suffer. Indifferent as to who may be the parties concerned, I but desire to see wrong things righted, and equal justice administered to all. Nor, as has been elsewhere hinted, is the general ignorance or depravity of any race of men to be alleged as an apology for tyranny over them. On the contrary, it cannot admit of a reasonable doubt, in any unbiased mind conversant with the interior life of a man of war, that most of the sailor iniquities practiced therein are indirectly to be ascribed to the morally debasing effects of the unjust, despotic, and degrading laws under which the man-of-war's man lives. End of Chapter 72. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 73 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 73. Night and Day, Gambling in a Man of War. Mention has been made that the game of draughts or checkers, was permitted to be played on board the Neversink. At the present time, while there was little or no ship work to be done, and all hands, in high spirits, were sailing homeward over the warm, smooth sea of the tropics, so numerous became the players scattered about the decks, that our first lieutenant used, ironically, to say that it was a pity they were not tessellated with squares of white and black marble, for the express benefit and convenience of the players. Had this gentleman had his way, our checkerboards would very soon have been pitched out of the ports. But the captain, usually lenient in some things, permitted them, and so Mr. Bridewell was fain to hold his peace. But although this one game was allowable in the frigate, all kinds of gambling were strictly interdicted, under the penalty of the gangway, nor were cards or dice tolerated in any way whatever. This regulation was indispensable, for of all human beings, man-of-war's men are perhaps the most inclined to gambling. The reason must be obvious to anyone who reflects upon their condition on shipboard, and gambling, the most mischievous of vices anywhere, in a man-of-war operates still more perniciously than on shore. But quite as often as the law against smuggling spirits is transgressed by the unscrupulous sailors, the statutes against cards and dice are evaded. Sable night, which, since the beginning of the world, has winked and looked on at so many deeds of iniquity, night is the time usually selected for their operations by man-of-war gamblers. The place pitched upon is generally the berth deck, where the hammocks are swung, and which is lighted so stintedly as not to disturb the sleeping seamen with any obtruding glare. In so spacious an area, the two lanterns swinging from the stanchions diffuse a subdued illumination, like a night taper in the apartment of some invalid. Owing to their position, also, these lanterns are far from shedding an impartial light, however dim, but fling long angular rays here and there, like burglars' dark lanterns in the 50-acre vaults of the West India docks on the Thames. It may well be imagined, therefore, how well adapted is this mysterious and subterranean hall of Eblis to the clandestine proceedings of gamblers, especially as the hammocks not only hang thickly, but many of them swing very low, within 2 feet of the floor, thus forming innumerable little canvas glens, grottos, nooks, corners, and crannies, where a good deal of wickedness may be practiced by the wary with considerable impunity. Now, the master-at-arms, assisted by his mates, the ship's corporals, reigns supreme in these bowels of the ship. Throughout the night these policemen relieve each other at standing guard over the premises, and, except when the watches are called, they sit in the midst of a profound silence, only invaded by trumpeters' snores, or the ramblings of some old sheet-anchorman in his sleep. The two ship's corporals went among the sailors by the names of Legs and Pounce. Pounce had been a policeman, it was said, in Liverpool. Legs, a turnkey attached to the Tombs in New York. Hence their education eminently fitted them for their stations, and Bland, the master-at-arms, ravished with their dexterity in prying out offenders, used to call them his 2 right hands. When man-of-war's men desire to gamble, they appoint the hour, and select some certain corner, in some certain shadow, behind some certain hammock. They then contribute a small sum toward a joint fund, to be invested in a bribe for some argus-eyed shipmate, who shall play the part of a spy upon the master-at-arms and corporals, while the gaming is in progress. In 9 cases out of 10, these arrangements are so cunning and comprehensive, that the gamblers, eluding all vigilance, conclude their game unmolested. But now and then, seduced into unwariness, or perhaps from parsimony, Being unwilling to employ the services of a spy, they are suddenly lighted upon by the constables, remorselessly collared, and dragged into the brig, there to await a dozen lashes in the morning. Several times at midnight I have been startled out of a sound sleep by a sudden violent rush under my hammock, caused by the abrupt breaking up of some nest of gamblers who have scattered in all directions, brushing under the tiers of swinging pallets and setting them all in a rocking commotion. It is, however, while laying in port that gambling most thrives in a man of war. Then the men frequently practice their dark deeds in the light of the day, and the additional guards which, at such times, they deem indispensable, are not unworthy of note. More especially, their extra precautions in engaging the services of several spies necessitate a considerable expenditure, so that, in port, the diversion of gambling rises to the dignity of a nabob luxury. During the day, the master-at-arms and his corporals are continually prowling about on all three decks, eager to spy out iniquities. At one time, for example, you see Leggs switching his magisterial rattan and lurking round the foremast on the spar-deck. The next moment, perhaps, he is 3 decks down, out of sight, prowling among the cable tiers. Just so with his master, and Pounce his coadjutor. They are here, there, and everywhere seemingly gifted with ubiquity. In order successfully to carry on their proceedings by day, the gamblers must see to it that each of these constables is relentlessly dogged wherever he goes, so that, in case of his approach toward the spot where themselves are engaged, they may be warned of the fact in time to make good their escape. Accordingly, light and active scouts are selected to follow the constable about. From their youthful alertness and activity, the boys of the mizzen-top are generally chosen for this purpose. But this is not all. On board of most men of war, there is a set of sly, knavish foxes among the crew, destitute of every principle of honor, and on a par with Irish informers. In man-of-war parlance, they come under the denomination of fancy-men and white mice. They are called fancy-men because, from their zeal in craftily reporting offenders, they are presumed to be regarded with high favor by some of the officers. Though it is seldom that these informers can be certainly individualized, so secret and subtle are they in laying their information, yet certain of the crew, and especially certain of the marines, are invariably suspected to be fancy-men and white mice, and are accordingly more or less hated by their comrades. Now, in addition to having an eye on the master-at-arms and his aids, the day gamblers must see to it that every person suspected of being a white mouse or fancy-man is likewise dogged wherever he goes. Additional scouts are retained constantly to snuff at their trail, but the mysteries of man-of-war vice are wonderful, and it is now to be recorded that, from long habit and observation and familiarity with the guardo moves and manoeuvres of a frigate, the master-at-arms and his aids can almost invariably tell when any gambling is going on by day, though in the crowded vessel, abounding in decks, tops, dark places, and outlandish corners of all sorts, they may not be able to pounce upon the identical spot where the gamblers are hidden. During the period that Bland was suspended from his office as master-at-arms, a person who, among the sailors, went by the name of Sneak, having been long suspected to have been a white mouse, was put in Bland's place. He proved a hang-dog, sidelong catch-thief, but gifted with a marvelous perseverance in ferreting out culprits, following in their track like an inevitable Cuba bloodhound, with his noiseless nose. When disconcerted, however, you sometimes heard his bay. "The muffled dice are somewhere around," Sneak would say to his aids. There are them 3 chaps there, been dogging me about for the last half-hour. I say, Pounce, has anyone been scouting around you this morning?" "4 on 'em," says Pounce. "I knowed it. I knowed the muffled dice was rattling." "Legs," says the master-at-arms to his other aide, "Legs, how is it with you? Any spies?" "10 on 'em," says Legs. "There's one on 'em now, that fellow stitching a hat." "Hello, you, sir!" cried the master-at-arms. "Top your boom and sail large now. If I see you about me again, I'll have you up to the mast." "What am I doing now?" says the hat-stitcher, with a face as long as a rope walk. "Can't a feller be working here without being 'spected a Tom Cox's traverse, up one ladder and down the other?" "Oh, I know the moves, sir. I have been on board a guardo. Top your boom, I say, and be off, or I'll have you hauled up and riveted in a clinch, both fore-tacks over the main-yard, and no bloody knife to cut the seizing. Sheer, or I'll pitch into you like a shin of beef into a beggar's wallet." It is often observable that in vessels of all kinds, the men who talk the most sailor lingo are the least sailor-like in reality. You may sometimes hear even marines jerk out more salt phrases than the captain of the forecastle himself. On the other hand, when not actively engaged in his vocation, you would take the best specimen of a seaman for a landsman. When you see a fellow yawning about the docks like a homeward-bound Indiaman, a long Commodore's pennant of black ribbon flying from his masthead, and fetching up at a grog-shop with a slew of his hull, as if an admiral were coming alongside a 3-decker in his barge, you may put that man down for what man-of-war's men call a damn-my-eyes tar; that is, a humbug. And many damn-my-eyes humbugs there are in this man-of-war world of ours. End of Chapter 73. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 74 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 74. The Maintop at Night. The whole of our run from Rio to the line was one delightful yachting, so far as fine weather and the ship's sailing were concerned. It was especially pleasant when our quarter-watch lounged in the maintop, diverting ourselves in many agreeable ways. Removed from the immediate presence of the officers, we there harmlessly enjoyed ourselves more than in any other part of the ship. By day, many of us were very industrious, making hats or mending our clothes. But by night we became more romantically inclined. Often Jack Chase, an enthusiastic admirer of sea scenery, would direct our attention to the moonlight on the waves by fine snatches from his catalogue of poets. I shall never forget the lyric air with which one morning, at dawn of day, when all the east was flushed with red and gold, he stood leaning against the topmast shrouds, and, stretching his bold hand over the sea, exclaimed, "Here comes Aurora, topmates, see!" And in a liquid, long, lingering tone he recited the lines: "With gentle hand, as seeming oft to pause, the purple curtains of the morn she draws." Commodore Camoens, White Jacket, but bear a hand there, we must rig out that stunsail boom, the wind is shifting. From our lofty perch of a moonlight night, the frigate itself was a glorious sight. She was going large before the wind, her stunsails set on both sides, so that the canvas on the mainmast and foremast presented the appearance of majestic tapering pyramids, more than 100 feet broad at the base, and terminating in the clouds with the light copestone of the royals. That immense area of snow-white canvas sliding along the sea was indeed a magnificent spectacle. The three shrouded masts looked like the apparitions of three gigantic Turkish emirs striding over the ocean. Nor, at times, was the sound of music wanting to augment the poetry of the scene. The whole band would be assembled on the poop, regaling the officers and, incidentally, ourselves, with their fine old airs. To these, some of us would occasionally dance in the top, which was almost as large as an ordinary-sized parlor. When the instrumental melody of the band was not to be had, our nightingales mustered their voices and gave us a song. Upon these occasions, Jack Chase was often called out, and regaled us in his own free and noble style, with the Spanish ladies, a favorite thing with British man-of-war's men, and many other salt-sea ballads and ditties, including Sir Patrick Spens was the best sailor that ever sailed the sea. Also, and 3 times around spun our gallant ship, 3 times around spun she, 3 times around spun our gallant ship, and she went to the bottom of the sea, the sea, the sea, the sea, and she went to the bottom of the sea. These songs would be varied by sundry yarns and twisters of the topmen, and it was at these times that I always endeavored to draw out the oldest Tritons into narratives of the war service they had seen. There were but few of them, it is true, who had been in action, but that only made their narratives the more valuable. There was an old negro, who went by the name of Tawney, a sheet-anchorman, whom we often invited into our top of tranquil nights, to hear him discourse. He was a staid and sober seaman, very intelligent, with a fine, frank bearing, one of the best men in the ship, and held in high estimation by everyone. It seems that during the last war between England and America, he had, with several others, been impressed upon the high seas out of a New England merchantman. The ship that impressed him was an English frigate, the Macedonian, afterward taken by the Neversink, the ship in which we were sailing. It was the Holy Sabbath, according to Tawney, and as the Briton bore down on the American, her men at their quarters, Tawney and his countrymen, who happened to be stationed at the quarter-deck battery, respectfully accosted the captain, an old man by the name of Carden, as he passed them in his rapid promenade, his spy-glass under his arm. Again they assured him that they were not Englishmen, and that it was a most bitter thing to lift their hands against the flag of that country which harbored the mothers that bore them. They conjured him to release them from their guns, and allow them to remain neutral during the conflict. But when a ship of any nation is running into action, it is no time for argument, small time for justice, and not much time for humanity. Snatching a pistol from the belt of a boarder standing by, the captain levelled it at the heads of the 3 sailors, and commanded them instantly to their quarters, under penalty of being shot on the spot. So, side by side with his country's foes, Tawney and his companions toiled at the guns and fought out the fight to the last, with the exception of one of them who was killed at his post by one of his own country's balls. At length, having lost her fore and main-top masts, and her mizzen-mast having been shot away to the deck, and her fore-yard lying in 2 pieces on her shattered forecastle, and in 100 places having been hulled with round shot, the English frigate was reduced to the last extremity. Captain Carden ordered his signal quartermaster to strike the flag. Tawney was one of those who, at last, helped pull him on board the Neversink. As he touched the deck, Carden saluted Decatur, the hostile commander, and offered his sword, but it was courteously declined. Perhaps the victor remembered the dinner parties that he and the Englishman had enjoyed together in Norfolk, just previous to the breaking out of hostilities, and while both were in command of the very frigates now crippled on the sea. The Macedonian, it seems, had gone into Norfolk with dispatches. Then they had laughed and joked over their wine, and a wager of a beaver hat was said to have been made between them upon the event of the hostile meeting of their ships. Gazing upon the heavy batteries before him, Cardan said to Decatur, "This is a 74, not a frigate. No wonder the day is yours." This remark was founded upon the Neversink's superiority in guns. The Neversink's main deck batteries then consisted, as now, of 24-pounders, the Macedonian's of only 18s. In all, the Neversink numbered 54 guns and 450 men, the Macedonian 49 guns and 300 men, a very great disparity, which, united to the other circumstances of this action, deprives the victory of all claims to glory beyond those that might be set up by a river horse getting the better of a seal. But if Tawney spoke truth, and he was a truth-telling man, this fact seemed counterbalanced by a circumstance he related. When the guns of the Englishmen were examined, after the engagement, in more than one instance the wad was found rammed against the cartridge, without intercepting the ball. And though, in a frantic sea-fight, such a thing might be imputed to hurry and remissness, yet Tawney, a stickler for his tribe, always ascribed it to quite a different and less honorable cause. But, even granting the cause he assigned to have been the true one, it does not involve anything inimical to the general valor displayed by the British crew. Yet, from all that may be learned from candid persons who have been in sea-fights, there can be but little doubt that on board of all ships, of whatever nation, in time of action, no very small number of the men are exceedingly nervous, to say the least, at the guns, ramming and sponging at a venture. And what special patriotic interest could an impressed man, for instance, take in a fight into which he had been dragged from the arms of his wife? Or is it to be wondered at that impressed English seamen have not scrupled, in time of war, to cripple the arm that has enslaved them? During the same general war which prevailed at and previous to the period of the frigate action here spoken of, a British flag officer, in writing to the Admiralty, said, "Everything appears to be quiet in the fleet, but, in preparing for battle last week, several of the guns in the after part of the ship were found to be spiked; that is to say, rendered useless." Who had spiked them? The dissatisfied seamen? Is it altogether improbable, then, that the guns to which Tawney referred were manned by men who purposely refrained from making them tell on the foe, that in this one action the victory America gained was partly won for her by the sulky insubordination of the enemy himself? During this same period of general war, it was frequently the case that the guns of English armed ships were found in the mornings with their breechings cut overnight. This maiming of the guns, and for the time incapacitating them, was only to be imputed to that secret spirit of hatred to the service which induced the spiking above referred to. But even in cases where no deep-seated dissatisfaction was presumed to prevail among the crew, and where a seaman in time of action, impelled by pure fear, shirked from his gun, it seems but flying in the face of Him who made such a seaman what he constitutionally was, to so coward upon his back, and degrade and agonize the already trembling wretch in numberless other ways. Nor seems it a practice warranted by the Sermon on the Mount for the officer of a battery, in time of battle, to stand over the men with his drawn sword, as was done in the Macedonian, and run through on the spot the first seaman who showed a semblance of fear. Tawney told me that he distinctly heard this order given by the English captain to his officers of divisions. Were the secret history of all sea fights written, the laurels of sea heroes would turn to ashes on their brows. And how nationally disgraceful, in every conceivable point of view, is the fourth of our American Articles of War. If any person in the Navy shall pusillanimously cry for quarter, he shall suffer death. Thus, with death before his face from the foe, and death behind his back from his countrymen, the best valor of a man-of-war's man can never assume the merit of a noble spontaneousness. In this, as in every other case, the Articles of War hold out no reward for good conduct, but only compel the sailor to fight like a hired murderer for his pay, by digging his grave before his eyes if he hesitates. But this Article 4 is open to still graver objections. Courage is the most common and vulgar of the virtues, the only one shared with us by the beasts of the field, the one most apt, by excess, to run into viciousness. And since nature generally takes away with one hand to counterbalance her gifts with the other, excessive animal courage, in many cases, only finds room in a character vacated of loftier things. But in a naval officer, animal courage is exalted to the loftiest merit, and often procures him a distinguished command. Hence, if some brainless bravo be captain of a frigate in action, he may fight her against invincible odds, and seek to crown himself with the glory of the shambles, by permitting his hopeless crew to be butchered before his eyes, while at the same time that crew must consent to be slaughtered by the foe, under penalty of being murdered by the law. Look at the engagement between the American frigate Essex with the two English cruisers, the Phoebe and Cherub, off the Bay of Valparaiso during the late war. It is admitted on all hands that the American captain continued to fight his crippled ship against a greatly superior force. And when, at last, it became physically impossible that he could ever be otherwise than vanquished in the end, and when, from peculiarly unfortunate circumstances, his men merely stood up to their nearly useless batteries to be dismembered and blown to pieces by the incessant fire of the enemy's long guns. Nor, by thus continuing to fight, did this American frigate, one iota, promote the true interests of her country. I seek not to underrate any reputation which the American captain may have gained by this battle. He was a brave man. That no sailor will deny. But the whole world is made up of brave men. Yet I would not be at all understood as impugning his special good name. Nevertheless, it is not to be doubted that if there were any common-sense sailors at the guns of the Essex, however valiant they may have been, those common-sense sailors must have greatly preferred to strike their flag, when they saw the day was fairly lost, than postpone that inevitable act till there were few American arms left to assist in hauling it down. Yet, had these men, under these circumstances, pusillanimously cried for quarter, by the fourth Article of War, they might have been legally hung. According to the negro Tawney, when the captain of the Macedonian, seeing that the Neversink had his vessel completely in her power, gave the word to strike the flag, one of his officers, a man hated by the seamen for his tyranny, howled out the most terrific remonstrances, swearing that, for his part, he would not give up, but was for sinking the Macedonian alongside the enemy. Had he been captain, doubtless he would have done so, thereby gaining the name of a hero in his world, but what would they have called him in the next? But as the whole matter of war is a thing that smites common sense and Christianity in the face, so everything connected with it is utterly foolish, unchristian, barbarous, brutal, and savoring of the Fiji Islands, cannibalism, saltpeter, and the devil. It is generally the case in a man of war, when she strikes her flag, that all discipline is at an end, and the men for a time are ungovernable. This was so on board of the English frigate. The spirit room was broken open, and buckets of grog were passed along the decks, where many of the wounded were lying between the guns. These mariners seized the buckets, and, spite of all remonstrances, gulped down the burning spirits, till, as Tawney said, the blood suddenly spurted out of their wounds, and they fell dead to the deck. The negro had many more stories to tell of this fight, and frequently he would escort me along our main-deck batteries, still mounting the same guns used in the battle, pointing out their ineffaceable indentations and scars. Coated over with the accumulated paint of more than 30 years, they were almost invisible to a casual eye, but Tawney knew them all by heart, for he had returned home in the Neversink, and had beheld these scars shortly after the engagement. One afternoon I was walking with him along the gun-deck, when he paused abreast of the mainmast. "This part of the ship," said he, "we called the slaughter-house on board the Macedonian. Here the men fell, 5 and 6 at a time. An enemy always directs its shot here, in order to hurl over the mast, if possible. The beams and carlines overhead in the Macedonian slaughter-house were spattered with blood and brains. About the hatchways it looked like a butcher's stall, bits of human flesh sticking in the ring-bolts. A pig that ran about the decks escaped unharmed, but his hide was so clotted with blood from rooting among the pools of gore, that when the ship struck, the sailors hove the animal overboard, swearing that it would be rank cannibalism to eat him. Another quadruped, a goat, lost its forelegs in this fight. The sailors who were killed, according to the usual custom, were ordered to be thrown overboard as soon as they fell, no doubt, as the negro said, that the sight of so many corpses lying around might not appall the survivors at the guns. Among other instances, he related the following: a shot entering one of the port-holes dashed dead 2/3 of a gun's crew. The captain of the next gun, dropping his lock-string, which he had just pulled, turned over the heap of bodies to see who they were, when, perceiving an old messmate who had sailed with him in many cruises, he burst into tears, and, taking the corpse up in his arms, and going with it to the side, held it over the water a moment, and, eyeing it, cried, "O God, Tom, blank your prayers over that thing." "Overboard with it, and down to your gun!" roared a wounded lieutenant. The order was obeyed, and the heart-stricken sailor returned to his post. Tawney's recitals were enough to snap this man-of-war world's sword in its scabbard. And thinking of all the cruel carnal glory wrought out by naval heroes in scenes like these, I asked myself whether, indeed, that was a glorious coffin in which Lord Nelson was entombed, a coffin presented to him during life by Captain Hallowell. It had been dug out of the mainmost of the French line of battleship L'Orient, which, burning up with British fire, destroyed hundreds of Frenchmen at the Battle of the Nile. Peace to Lord Nelson where he sleeps in his mouldering mast, but rather would I be urned in the trunk of some green tree, and even in death have the vital sap circulating round me, giving of my dead body to the living foliage that shaded my peaceful tomb. End of chapter 74. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 75 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 75. Sink, Burn, and Destroy. Printed Admiralty Orders in Time of War. Among innumerable yarns and twisters reeled off in our main-top during our pleasant run to the north, none could match those of Jack Chase, our captain. Never was there better company than ever glorious Jack. The things which most men only read of, or dream about, he had seen and experienced. He had been a dashing smuggler in his day, and could tell of a long 9-pounder rammed home with wads of French silks, of cartridges stuffed with the finest gunpowder tea, of canister shot full of West India sweetmeats, of sailor frocks and trousers quilted inside with costly laces, and table legs, hollow as musket barrels, compactly stowed with rare drugs and spices. He could tell of a wicked widow, too, a beautiful receiver of smuggled goods upon the English coast, who smiled so sweetly upon the smugglers when they sold her silks and laces cheap as tape and ginghams. She called them gallant fellows, hearts of game, and bade them bring her more. He could tell of desperate fights with his British Majesty's cutters in midnight coves upon a stormy coast, of the capture of a reckless band and their being drafted on board a man of war, of their swearing that their chief was slain, of a writ of habeas corpus sent on board for one of them for a debt, a reserved and handsome man, and his going ashore, strongly suspected of being the slaughtered captain, and this a successful scheme for his escape. But more than all, Jack could tell of the Battle of Navarino, for he had been a captain of one of the main-deck guns on board Admiral Codrington's flagship, the Asia. Were mine the style of stout old Chapman's Homer, even then I would scarce venture to give noble Jack's own version of this fight, wherein, on the 20th of October, A.D. 1827, 32 sail of Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Russians attacked and vanquished in the Levant an Ottoman fleet of 3 ships of the line, 25 frigates, and a swarm of fire-ships and hornet craft. "We bayed to be at them," said Jack, "and when we did open fire, we were like dolphin among the flying fish. Every man take his bird," was the cry, when we trained our guns. And those guns all smoked like rows of Dutch pipe bowls, my hearties. My gun's crew carried small flags in their bosoms, to nail to the mast in case the ship's colours were shot away. Stripped to the waistbands, we fought like skinned tigers, and bowled down the Turkish frigates like ninepins. Among their shrouds, swarming thick with small-arm men, like flights of pigeons lighted on pine-trees, our marines sent their leaden peas and gooseberries like a shower of hailstones in Labrador. It was a stormy time, my hearties. The blasted Turks pitched into the old Asia's hull a whole quarry of marble shot, each ball 150 pounds. They knocked 3 port-holes into one. But we gave them better than they sent up. "Up and at them, my bulldog," said I, patting my gun on the breech. "Tear open hatchways in their Moslem sides. White Jacket, my lad, you ought to have been there. The bay was covered with masts and yards, as I have seen a raft of snags in the Arkansas River. Showers of burned rice and olives from the exploding foe fell upon us like manna in the wilderness. Allah! Allah! Mohammed! Mohammed! Split the air. Some cried it out from the Turkish port-holes, others shrieked it forth from the drowning waters, their top-knots floating on their shaven skulls, like black snakes on half-tide rocks. By those top-knots they believed that their prophet would drag them up to paradise, but they sank 50 fathoms, my hearties, to the bottom of the bay. "Ain't the bloody Hometons going to strike yet?" cried my first loader, a Guernseyman, thrusting his neck out of the port-hole and looking at the Turkish line of battle-ship near by. That instant his head blew by me like a bursting paysan shot, and the flag of Neb Knowles himself was hauled down forever. We dragged his hull to one side, and avenged him with the cooper's anvil, which, endways, we rammed home. A messmate shoved in the dead man's bloody Scotch cap for the wad, and sent it flying into the line of battleship. By the God of War, boys, we hardly left enough of that craft to boil a pot of water with. It was a hard day's work, a sad day's work, my hearties. That night, when all was over, I slept sound enough, with a box of canister shot for my pillow. But you ought to have seen the boatload of Turkish flags one of our captains carried home. He swore to dress his father's orchard in colors with them, just as our spars are dressed for a gala day. Though you tormented the Turks at Navarino, noble Jack, yet you come off yourself with only the loss of a splinter, it seems, said a topman, glancing at our captain's maimed hand. Yes, but I and one of the lieutenants had a narrower escape than that. A shot struck the side of my porthole, and sent the splinters right and left. One took off my hat rim clean to my brow. Another razed the lieutenant's left boot by slicing off the heel. A third shot killed my powder monkey without touching him. How, Jack? It whizzed the poor babe dead. He was seated on a cheese of wads at the time, and after the dust of the powdered bulwarks had blown away, I noticed he yet sat still, his eyes wide open. My little hero, cried I, and I clapped him on the back. But he fell on his face at my feet. I touched his heart, and found he was dead. There was not a little finger mark on him. Silence now fell upon the listeners for a time, broken at last by the second captain of the top. Noble Jack, I know you never brag, but tell us what you did yourself that day. Why, my hearties, I did not do quite as much as my gun. But I flatter myself it was that gun that brought down the Turkish admiral's mainmast, and the stump left wasn't long enough to make a wooden leg for Lord Nelson. How? But I thought by the way you pull a lock-string on board here and look along the sight that you can steer a shot about right, hey, Jack? It was the Admiral of the Fleet, God Almighty, who directed the shot that dismasted the Turkish admiral, said Jack. I only pointed the gun. But how did you feel, Jack, when the musket ball carried away one of your hooks there? Feel? Only a finger the lighter. I have 7 more left, besides thumbs, and they did good service, too, in the torn rigging the day after the fight. For you must know, my hearties, that the hardest work comes after the guns are run in. 3 days I helped work, with one hand, in the rigging, in the same trousers that I wore in the action. The blood had dried and stiffened. They looked like glazed red morocco. Now, this Jack Chase had a heart in him like a mastodon's. I have seen him weep when a man has been flogged at the gangway. Yet, in relating the story of the Battle of Navarino, he plainly showed that he held the God of the blessed Bible to have been the British Commodore in the Levant, on the bloody 20th of October, A.D. 1827. And thus it would seem that war almost makes blasphemers of the best of men, and brings them all down to the Fiji standard of humanity. Some man-of-war's men have confessed to me that, as a battle has raged more and more, their hearts have hardened in infernal harmony, and, like their own guns, they have fought without a thought. Soldier or sailor, the fighting man is but a fiend, and the staff and bodyguard of the devil musters many a baton. But war at times is inevitable. Must the national honor be trampled under foot by an insolent foe? Say on, but know you this, and lay it to heart, war-boding bench of bishops, that he, on whom we believe, himself has enjoined us to turn the left cheek if the right be smitten. Never mind what follows. That passage you cannot expunge from the Bible. That passage is as binding upon us as any other. That passage embodies the soul and substance of the Christian faith. Without it, Christianity were like any other faith. And that passage will yet, by the blessing of God, turn the world. But in some things we must turn Quakers first. But though unlike most scenes of carnage, which have proved useless murders of men, Admiral Codrington's victory undoubtedly achieved the emancipation of Greece, and terminated the Turkish atrocities in that tomahawked state, yet who shall lift his hand and swear that a divine providence led the van of the combined fleets of England, France, and Russia at the battle of Navarino? For if this be so, then it led the van against the Church's own elect, the persecuted Waldenses of Switzerland, and kindled the Smithfield fires in Bloody Mary's time. But all events are mixed in a fusion indistinguishable. What we call fate is even heartless and impartial, not a fiend to kindle bigot flames, nor a philanthropist to espouse the cause of Greece. We may fret, fume, and fight, but the thing called fate everlastingly sustains an armed neutrality. Yet, though all this be so, nevertheless, in our own hearts we mould the whole world's hereafters, and in our own hearts we fashion our own gods. Each mortal casts his vote for whom he will to rule the worlds. I have a voice that helps to shape eternity, and my volitions stir the orbits of the furthest suns. In two senses we are precisely what we worship. Ourselves are fate. End of chapter 75. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.